I spent 32 years being the family ghost present, but invisible needed, but never valued. So when my mother called 5 days before Christmas to uninvite me, her words didn't even surprise me anymore. Your sister is bringing her boyfriend to meet the family. She doesn't want you there. Your blue-collar job would embarrass her in front of him. I should have felt something. Anger, maybe. Hurt, definitely. Instead, I just said, I understand, and hung up. What my family didn't know, what nobody knew, was that our grandfather had left my golden child sister a $25 million trust fund, and he'd made me the one person who controlled every single cent of it. 5 days later, they appeared at my door like a hurricane. My parents frantic, my sister in tears, and her boyfriend wearing the fakest smile I'd ever seen. The moment he saw me, everything changed. She's the one we need to please, he told them urgently. And I realised I was done being invisible. What happened next would shatter my family's lives forever and force them to see me for the very first time. My name is Monique Henderson. I'm 32 years old. And if you asked my family what I do for a living, they'd tell you I clean houses and do odd jobs around town. They'd probably add that I never quite figured out how to make something of myself, not like my younger sister Ashley. What they don't know, what I've never told them, is that I own 3 rental properties across 2 states and have an investment portfolio that generates more in a month than most people earn in 6, the blue-collar work. That's just how I like to spend my time. It keeps me grounded, keeps me moving, and most importantly, it keeps me under their radar. I learned a long time ago that being underestimated has its advantages. When you're invisible, people stop watching what you do. They stop asking questions. They certainly stop expecting anything from you, which means they also stop being disappointed. My family perfected the art of disappointment when it came to me, so I simply removed myself from their expectations entirely. I bought my first duplex at 24 with money I'd saved from working 3 jobs through college. I paid for myself, by the way, while Ashley's tuition checks arrived like clockwork from our parents. Nobody asked how I afforded the down payment. Nobody wondered why I was suddenly taking property management courses online. They were too busy celebrating Ashley's graduation. Ashley's new job, Ashley's perfect life that somehow always required their financial rescue every few months. The pattern established itself so gradually that I didn't even notice it becoming permanent. Every family dinner, I'd arrive with a dish I'd made from scratch, and my mother would set it on the corner of the table while praising the store-bought dessert Ashley brought. Every holiday I'd offer to host, and the suggestion would be politely declined in favour of gathering at my parents' house where Ashley felt more comfortable. Every achievement I mentioned in passing would be met with a brief nod before the conversation pivoted back to whatever minor inconvenience Ashley was currently navigating. I became a supporting character in my own family story, always present in the background but never quite in focus. The thing is, I let it happen. I chose silence over confrontation every single time because somewhere deep down, I believed that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. I told myself that my strength was in not needing their validation and being self-sufficient, while Ashley required constant propping up. I convinced myself that being the reliable one, the one who never caused problems or asked for anything, was a badge of honour. What I didn't realise until much later was that I'd made myself so small and so quiet that I'd practically disappeared. I'd looked at apartments in Seattle last spring. I'd even gone so far as to schedule a video tour of a beautiful 1-bedroom with a view of the water. I'd researched property management companies that could handle my rentals remotely. I'd mapped out a new life where I could finally stop performing this exhausting role of the family ghost. But the day before, I was supposed to fly out and see the place in person. My father called asking if I could help him clean out the garage, and I heard myself saying yes. I cancelled the flight. I stayed. Because despite everything, despite the years of being overlooked and undervalued, some part of me still couldn't let go of the idea that family was supposed to matter more than my own peace. Then a phone call stopped me cold in my kitchen. It was a Tuesday evening, and I just pulled a tray of roasted vegetables from the oven when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I almost didn't answer. Something about the timing felt off. She never called during the week, unless she needed something, and I'd already helped my father with 3 separate projects that month. But habit won out over intuition, and I wiped my hands on a towel before picking up. "Monique, honey, I need to talk to you about Thanksgiving." Her voice had that particular tone I'd learnt to recognise over the years, the one that meant she was about to ask me to accommodate something I wouldn't like. The one that came with the unspoken expectation that I'd simply agree, without making things difficult. I set down the oven mitt and leaned against the counter, already bracing myself. "What about Thanksgiving?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to let you know the other person is choosing their words carefully. "Well, Ashley is bringing her boyfriend Brian this year. It's the first time she's introducing him to the family, and she's quite nervous about making a good impression." "That's nice," I said, genuinely meaning it, despite everything. I'd heard about Brian in passing, some finance guy Ashley had been dating for 4 months, apparently serious enough to warrant a holiday introduction. "I'm looking forward to meeting him." Another pause, longer this time. "That's the thing, sweetheart. Ashley feels it would be better if it was just the immediate family this year. You know, keep things simple and intimate for Brian's first time." I felt something shift in my chest, a small crack in the foundation I carefully maintained. I was immediate family. I'd been at every single Thanksgiving for 32 years. "I don't understand." My mother's voice dropped lower, as if someone might overhear her. "She's just very anxious about everything being perfect. Brian comes from a very successful family, old money, you know the type. He works in private equity and his parents are quite prominent in their social circles. Ashley wants to make sure everything reflects well." The implication hung in the air, between us heavy and unmistakable, but I still needed her to say it. "And I don't reflect well." "It's not like that, Monique. Don't be dramatic." The slight edge in her voice told me I was already pushing too hard, already being difficult, just by asking for clarification. "It's just that Ashley mentioned you work cleaning houses and doing handyman jobs, and Brian might not understand that kind of career choice. He might think it's odd or wonder why you're not more ambitious. Ashley doesn't want to spend the dinner explaining your situation when she's trying to focus on her relationship." My situation? As if my life was some kind of problem that required explanation or apology. I thought about my mortgage-free rental properties, my diversified portfolio, my complete financial independence, that none of them knew about because I'd never felt the need to prove anything. I thought about how I'd worked for every single thing I had, while Ashley floated through life on a cushion of parental support, and then complained about how hard everything was. "So, I'm not invited to Thanksgiving," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. "It's just this 1 year, honey, just to let Ashley have her moment without any complications. You understand, don't you? You've always been so good about understanding." There it was, the familiar script where I was expected to be the understanding one, the accommodating one, the one who never made waves or asked for anything in return, the one who absorbed every slight and every dismissal with grace, because that was my role in this family. "I understand." I heard myself say the words coming out automatically, even as something inside me started to crumble. My heart was breaking in a way I hadn't allowed it to break before, but my voice remained steady and calm. "I understand completely." "Oh, good. I knew you would. You're such a sweetheart about these things. We'll do something special, just the 2 of us, another time. Maybe lunch next week." We both knew that lunch would never happen. It would be forgotten the moment she hung up, just another empty promise made to smooth over an uncomfortable moment. "Sure, Mum. That sounds nice." "Wonderful. I need to run. Your father is calling me. Love you, sweetheart." She ended the call before I could respond, and I stood there in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence where my mother's voice had been. The roasted vegetables were getting cold on the counter. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and olive oil. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I'd been explicitly uninvited from a family gathering. Not overlooked, not forgotten, but deliberately excluded because my existence was an embarrassment, because my sister was ashamed of me, because my life, which I'd built with my own hands and my own determination, wasn't good enough to be displayed in front of her boyfriend from Old Money. I didn't know this was just the beginning of something much bigger. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at the roasted vegetables going cold, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, watching my mother arrange an elaborate princess-themed birthday party for Ashley's 5th birthday. There'd been a bouncy castle, a petting zoo, and a professional photographer who followed Ashley around, capturing every moment of her special day. My own 8th birthday had been celebrated 3 months earlier, with a grocery store cake and a small gathering of neighbours' kids in our backyard. When I'd asked why Ashley's party was so much bigger, my mother had smiled and said, "Well, sweetheart, you're not really into all that fuss, are you? You're my practical girl." I hadn't known how to articulate that I'd never been given the chance to be into that fuss. The label had been applied so early and so consistently that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Monique is the strong one. Monique doesn't need as much attention. Monique understands. The words had followed me through childhood like a mantra, shaping me into exactly what they expected, while simultaneously ensuring I'd never receive what Ashley got by default. The college funding situation had been the most glaring example, though. I'd worked hard to pretend it didn't bother me. Ashley's tuition room and board had been paid in full by our parents, along with a generous monthly allowance for expenses. She'd joined a sorority, studied abroad for a semester in Italy, and graduated with 0 debt and a degree she'd changed 3 times. When I'd asked about help with college during my senior year of high school, my father had looked uncomfortable and explained that Ashley's needs had stretched their budget thin. "But you're so resourceful, Monique. You'll figure it out. You always do." So I had figured it out. I'd worked 40 hours a week while taking a full course load. I'd lived in a basement apartment that flooded every spring. I'd eaten ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, while Ashley posted photos of her study abroad adventures on social media. And when I'd graduated with honours and no debt, the family celebration had lasted about 10 minutes before conversation shifted to Ashley's struggle to find a job that felt meaningful enough for her particular talents. The pattern had continued long after we'd both left home. Every time Ashley had a breakup, a job loss, or a financial crisis, our parents rallied around her with emotional support and bailout checks. When I'd mentioned casually that I was feeling burned out from working multiple jobs, my mother had suggested I try yoga and asked if I could pick up a prescription for my father on my way home. My exhaustion was treated as a minor inconvenience I should manage better. Ashley's exhaustion required family intervention and a 2-week vacation that our parents funded. What hurt most wasn't the unequal distribution of resources I'd made peace with that years ago. It was the unequal distribution of care. Ashley was allowed to fall apart and be caught. I was expected to be the net that caught everyone else. They called on me to help paint their house, to troubleshoot their computer problems, to pick them up from the airport at inconvenient times. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and organised the family photos and made sure Grandma got her weekly phone call. But when I'd had pneumonia 2 years ago and spent 4 days in bed barely able to move, nobody had checked on me. I'd mentioned it at the next family dinner, and my mother had looked surprised and said, "Oh, honey, I thought you were just busy with work. You should have told us you needed something." The truth was, I'd learned long ago that telling them I needed something was pointless. Need was a language they only spoke fluently with Ashley. With me, need was translated as weakness, as a failure of that strength they'd assigned to me before I was old enough to consent to the role. I remembered one afternoon when I was about 12 overhearing an argument between my mother and Grandma in the kitchen. Grandma had been visiting and had apparently commented on the difference in how my mother treated her 2 daughters. "You're too hard on Monique," Grandma had said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "That child does everything you ask and never complains, and you treat her like she's supposed to just absorb whatever you don't have time for." My mother's response had been defensive and immediate. "She's fine, Mother. She's strong. Not everyone needs to be coddled like Ashley does. Monique can handle things. Just because she can handle things doesn't mean she should have to handle everything alone, Grandma had shot back. You're going to lose that girl one day if you keep taking her for granted. The argument had ended shortly after, but I'd never forgotten the way my mother had dismissed Grandma's concern, using almost the exact same words she'd use on me for the next 20 years. You're being dramatic. You're so good about understanding. You're my strong one. The phrases that sounded like compliments, but functioned as silencers, ways to ensure I never asked for the care and attention that flowed so freely toward my sister. Standing in my kitchen at 32, I realised with sudden clarity that my mother had learned this pattern from somewhere too. The way she'd snapped at Grandma for suggesting she was too hard on me, it carried echoes of her own childhood, her own experiences of being measured against some impossible standard. The cycle had been running for generations, and I'd been caught in its machinery without ever understanding how deep the gears went. But Grandpa was the only one who truly saw me. Grandpa had been different from the beginning. While everyone else praised Ashley's social charm and worried about her sensitive nature, Grandpa would pull me aside during family gatherings and ask about the books I was reading or the projects I was working on. He never seemed to buy into the narrative that I was fine on my own, that I didn't need the same attention Ashley received. Instead, he'd look at me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing and say things like, "Being strong doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone, you know." When he died 5 years ago, the grief hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd lost the one person in my family who seemed to actually see me as a complete person rather than a convenient support system. The funeral had been predictably divided in focus. Ashley had sobbed dramatically throughout the service, while I'd stood dry-eyed and steady, which everyone interpreted as me being strong again rather than completely hollowed out inside. Nobody had asked if I was okay. They'd simply assumed I was handling it the way I handled everything else. 3 weeks after the funeral, Grandpa's lawyer had called and asked me to come to his office alone. I'd assumed it was about some minor bequest, maybe his collection of old books he knew I'd loved looking through as a child. I certainly hadn't expected to walk into that wood-panelled office and have my entire understanding of my family's future rewritten in the span of an hour. Your grandfather left very specific instructions regarding his estate, the lawyer had said, sliding a thick folder across his desk toward me. The bulk of his assets, approximately $25 million, has been placed in trust for your sister Ashley. My first reaction had been a familiar resignation. Of course. Even in death, Ashley got the grand gesture while I got whatever was left over. It was so predictable it almost didn't hurt. Then the lawyer had continued. However, he's named you as the sole trustee with full discretionary control over all distributions. I'd stared at him, not quite processing the words. I'm sorry, what? You control the trust completely. Ashley is the beneficiary, but she cannot access any of the funds without your approval. Your grandfather was very clear about this arrangement. He'd opened the folder and pointed to a document dense with legal language. He's outlined specific conditions that must be met before funds can be distributed. Ashley must maintain a credit score above 650, keep her total debt below $5,000, and complete a series of financial literacy courses. Until she meets these requirements, the trust remains locked. The implications had crashed over me like a wave. $25 million, my sister's entire financial future. And Grandpa had put me the one person the family consistently dismissed and undervalued in complete control of it. Does my family know about this? I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Not the details. They know there's a trust for Ashley, but they believe it's structured to distribute automatically when she turns 30 or gets married, something simple and straightforward. Your grandfather specifically requested that the trustee arrangement and the conditions remain confidential unless you choose to disclose them. The lawyer had paused, studying my face. He told me you'd understand why he did this, even if it feels like a burden. And I had understood even then. Grandpa had watched for decades as Ashley was given everything without having to work for any of it, and he'd seen how it had shaped her into someone who expected the world to simply provide. He'd also watched me be taken for granted, over and over my competence and reliability, treated as inexhaustible resources rather than gifts I chose to give. This wasn't just about money. It was about forcing both of us to change Ashley to grow up, and me to finally use the power I'd never allowed myself to claim. The lawyer had pulled out 2 sealed envelopes from a separate drawer. "Your grandfather left these for you personally. This first one contains a letter explaining his reasoning for the trust structure and some guidance for your role as trustee." He'd handed it to me, and I'd opened it right there, reading Grandpa's familiar handwriting, telling me that I was the only one he trusted to make fair decisions, to push Ashley toward responsibility, without cruelty, to be both firm and compassionate in a way our parents had never managed. Then, the lawyer had held up the second envelope, noticeably thicker than the first. "This one he instructed me to give you with specific directions. You're only to open it when you truly need it, when you face a decision so difficult that you need his guidance from beyond. He said you'd know when that moment came." I'd taken the second envelope with trembling hands, running my fingers over my name written in Grandpa's careful script. It had felt weighty, important, like it contained something more than just paper and ink. "Did he tell you what's in it?" "No, and I didn't ask. Your grandfather was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, even when his reasoning wasn't immediately clear to others." The lawyer had given me a small knowing smile. "He trusted you with an enormous responsibility, Monique. That says everything about how he saw you." I'd left that office with 2 envelopes, a folder full of legal documents, and the stunning realization that I held my sister's entire financial future in my hands. For 5 years I'd kept this secret, watching Ashley drift through jobs and relationships, watching my parents continue to bail her out of financial predicaments, knowing all the while that there was a massive safety net waiting for her, if she could just prove she was ready for it. I checked in with the lawyer quarterly to review her credit reports and financial statements as required by my trustee duties. She'd never come close to meeting the conditions. The credit score hovered around 580. Her debt regularly exceeded $15,000. She'd never shown any interest in learning about financial management. The family had no idea. They thought I was just their reliable Monique, steady and unimportant, while in reality I was the gatekeeper to Ashley's entire inheritance. And in all that time, through every family slight and every moment of being taken for granted, I'd never once been tempted to open that second envelope. But I never asked what was in that second envelope. The second envelope sat in my home safe, along with all the trust documents untouched and waiting for a moment I couldn't yet define. Sometimes, late at night, I'd take it out and hold it, feeling its weight, wondering what Grandpa had written that required such specific conditions for reading. But something always stopped me from breaking the seal. Maybe it was respect for his wishes, or maybe it was fear that once I read whatever was inside, I'd have to make decisions I wasn't ready to make. What I did revisit almost constantly was our last real conversation. It had happened in the hospital 3 days before he died, on a grey afternoon when the fluorescent lights made everything feel too bright and too clinical. The rest of the family had just left after a brief visit. Ashley had found the hospital environment too depressing and had needed to go home and rest, and my parents had gone with her to make sure she was okay. I'd stayed behind because someone needed to be there when the doctors made their evening rounds, and as always, that someone was me. Grandpa had been in and out of consciousness all the cancer medication, making him drift between clarity and confusion. But when I'd pulled my chair close to his bed and taken his hand, his eyes had opened and focused on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. His grip, surprisingly strong for someone so diminished by illness, had tightened around my fingers. "Monique," he'd said, his voice rough but clear, "I need you to listen to me." "I'm here, Grandpa. I'm listening." I'd leaned in closer, wanting to catch every word somehow, knowing that this might be one of our last chances to really talk. You're the strongest person in this family." His eyes had held mine, not letting me look away or deflect the compliment the way I usually did. "You've been strong since you were a little girl, carrying things no child should have to carry. And you never complained, not once." I'd felt tears starting to build, but had blinked them back, not wanting to waste our time together on crying. "You made it easier. You always saw me." "I did see you. I saw everything." His thumb had moved gently across my knuckles, the gesture achingly familiar from 1,000 childhood moments when he'd comforted me this same way. "And that's why I need to tell you this, because nobody else will. Your strength is a gift, Monique. It's real and it's powerful, and this family has relied on it more than they even understand. But don't let that strength become a burden that crushes you." At the time, exhausted from days of hospital vigils and juggling work schedules to be present, I hadn't fully grasped what he was trying to tell me. I'd thought he was simply being sentimental, offering the kind of gentle wisdom that dying people often share when they want to leave something meaningful behind. I'd squeezed his hand and promised at him I'd be okay, that I was fine, using all the usual phrases I'd trained myself to say automatically. "You're not listening." His voice had sharpened despite his weakness, pulling me out of my automatic responses. "Being strong doesn't mean carrying everyone else's weight until your back breaks. It doesn't mean making yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. Real strength, the kind that lasts, includes knowing when to say no, knowing when to let people fall so they can learn to catch themselves." I'd nodded, but I don't think I'd really heard him. Not then. I was too caught up in the immediate crisis of losing him, too focused on being present and capable and strong in exactly the way he was warning me against. After he'd drifted back to sleep, I'd sat there holding his hand for another 2 hours, until a nurse had gently suggested I go home and rest. 3 days later, he was gone, and I'd stood at his funeral being strong, while Ashley fell apart, and the irony of that moment would hit me later when I replayed his words in my mind. In the 5 years since his death, those words had come back to me again and again, usually in moments when I felt the weight of family expectations pressing down especially hard. Every time I said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I absorbed someone else's crisis without acknowledging my own needs, I'd hear his voice. "Don't let that strength become a burden that crushes you." And every time I'd tell myself I was fine, I could handle it. This was just what strong people did. But after that phone call about Thanksgiving, standing alone in my kitchen with cold roasted vegetables and a heart that felt like it was finally breaking under all those years of accumulated weight, Grandpa's words had echoed differently. For the first time, I'd really heard what he'd been trying to tell me. He'd known this moment would come eventually. He'd known that my family would keep taking and taking until there was a moment so stark, so undeniably cruel, that even I couldn't rationalize it away as just keeping the peace. He'd also known I'd need help when that moment arrived, which was why he'd given me control of Ashley's trust. It wasn't just about teaching Ashley responsibility. It was about giving me permission to finally use my strength in a different way, not to carry everyone else, but to set down the weight I'd been conditioned to accept as my natural role. I thought I understood the trust arrangement. I thought I knew why Grandpa had structured things the way he had. But standing there in the aftermath of being explicitly excluded from my own family's Thanksgiving, I realised I'd only understood the surface level. The trust wasn't a burden he'd placed on me. It was a tool he'd given me for my own liberation. 5 days after that Thanksgiving call, my family appeared like a storm. I'd spent those 5 days in a strange state of limbo, going through the motions of my regular life while feeling fundamentally disconnected from it. I'd cleaned Mrs. Patterson's house on Wednesday, fixed a leaking faucet for the Johnsons on Thursday, and checked on my rental properties Friday morning. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside something had shifted. I kept thinking about Grandpa's words about strength that crushes rather than sustains, and I kept wondering if this was the moment he'd anticipated when he'd sealed that second envelope. It was Saturday afternoon when they came. I was in my living room reorganising a bookshelf, the kind of mindless task I did when I needed to think when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, but the kind of aggressive hammering that suggested whoever was on the other side had moved past courtesy into something closer to desperation or rage. I knew before I opened the door. Some instinct told me exactly who I'd find, though I couldn't have explained how I knew or what had finally triggered this confrontation. When I pulled the door open, all four of them were crowded onto my small porch. Mum, Dad Ashley, and a man I'd never met, but instantly recognised as Brian from Ashley's social media photos. My mother's face was flushed, her eyes bright with an emotion somewhere between fury and panic. My father stood slightly behind her with his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was deeply uncomfortable, but committed to backing whatever play Mum had decided on. Ashley looked like she'd been crying, her makeup smudged and her expression hovering between righteous anger and something that might have been fear. But it was Brian who caught my attention. While the rest of them radiated barely controlled emotional chaos, he stood at the back with an expression of calculated assessment, his eyes moving over me with an intensity that felt almost predatory. He was handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive grooming and good genetics tailored shirt, perfect hair, the kind of casual confidence that old money produces. And he was far too composed given the apparent crisis that had brought them all to my doorstep. "We need to talk," my mother said, her voice tight. "Right now." I didn't move from the doorway. Some instinct told me that letting them inside would be yielding ground I couldn't afford to lose. "About what? Don't play games, Monique." Ashley pushed forward, her voice cracking. We know about the trust. We know what Grandpa did." So that was it. 5 years of secret keeping ended by whatever chain of events had led them from ignorance to this moment of fury on my porch. I kept my face carefully neutral. "I see." "You see," my mother's voice climbed higher. "That's all you have to say. You've been controlling Ashley's entire inheritance for 5 years, and you never thought to mention it. Grandpa specifically requested that the arrangement remain confidential unless I chose to disclose it. I kept my tone even factual, giving them nothing emotional to latch onto. I was following his wishes. His wishes. My father spoke for the first time, and I was surprised by the edge of anger in his usually mild voice. "His wishes were to put you in charge of $25 million, you who works odd jobs and lives in this little house." The casual dismissal in his words, the assumption that my life choices meant I was somehow less capable, less trustworthy, landed exactly as it always had. Except this time, instead of absorbing it silently, I felt something different stir inside me, something that might have been the beginning of the anger I'd suppressed for 3 decades. Before I could respond, Brian moved forward with startling suddenness, easing past Ashley and my parents until he was standing directly in front of me. The shift in his demeanour was so complete, it was almost physically jarring. The calculating distance vanished, replaced by a warm smile and an extended hand. "Monique, hi, I'm Brian Matthews. I've heard so much about you." His voice was smooth friendly, with just the right note of apology for the dramatic circumstances of our first meeting. "I'm so sorry we're meeting like this. This is clearly a family matter that got a bit heated before anyone had a chance to think through the right approach." I stared at his outstretched hand, not taking it. 5 minutes ago, I'd been uninvited from Thanksgiving because my existence would embarrass Ashley in front of this man. Now he was standing on my porch, acting like we were old friends, having an unfortunate misunderstanding. Ashley was just trying to understand the timeline for her inheritance. Brian continued smoothly, apparently unbothered by my refusal to shake his hand. Completely reasonable question, really. The lawyer mentioned your role, and I think everyone was just surprised by the arrangement. But now that we're all here, maybe we can discuss this like adults and figure out a path forward that works for everyone. His eyes met mine, and I saw something flicker there beneath the friendly exterior. A sharp intelligence doing rapid calculations. He'd sized up the situation faster than my own family had, understanding in seconds what it had taken them hours or days to process. I wasn't the family embarrassment anymore. I was the person who controlled something he wanted, Please, he said, and his tone shifted to something more earnest, more conspiratorial, as if we were allies in managing this difficult family situation together. Could we come inside and talk about this calmly? I think there might be some misunderstandings we can clear up. Behind him, my mother nodded eagerly, clearly grateful that someone was taking charge and smoothing over the awkwardness. Ashley was watching Brian with something like relief, as if his intervention had validated her right to be angry, while also providing a more civilized framework for that anger. My father still looked uncomfortable, but he'd already started to defer to Brian's leadership in the situation. And I realized with sudden crystalline clarity that Brian had just executed a perfect power play in the span of 30 seconds. He'd assessed the dynamics, recognized that aggression would put me on the defensive, and pivoted to treating me as the decision-maker who needed to be courted rather than confronted. His first words made me freeze. "She's the one we need to please," Brian said, turning slightly to address my parents and Ashley, without taking his eyes off me. His voice carried a note of gentle correction, as if he were patiently explaining obvious facts to people who'd momentarily forgotten themselves. "Monique is the trustee. She makes the decisions. Coming in hot like this isn't going to help Ashley get access to her inheritance any faster." The effect of his words was instantaneous, and almost comical if it hadn't been so deeply insulting. My mother's mouth, which had been open preparing another volley of accusations, snapped shut. Ashley's tear-streaked face shifted from anger to something closer to uncertainty, her eyes darting between Brian and me as she recalibrated. My father's rigid posture softened slightly, though the confusion in his expression suggested he was struggling to catch up with this sudden change in approach. "Of course," my mother said after a beat, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard her use with me before, careful, almost deferential. "We didn't mean to come across so aggressively. We were just surprised, that's all. It's been quite a shock learning about this arrangement." "Very surprising," my father added quickly, apparently deciding that backing my mother's new approach was safer than maintaining his earlier anger. "We had no idea Grandpa had set things up this way. Perhaps we should have reached out more thoughtfully to discuss it." I stood there watching them transform. In real time, these people who'd spent 32 years treating me like convenient furniture suddenly rearranging themselves into supplicants. The shift was so complete and so transparently calculated that I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't recognition of my worth as a person. This wasn't regret for how they treated me or acknowledgement of decades of dismissal. This was pure transactional adjustment based on the sudden realization that I controlled something they wanted. Ashley took a hesitant step forward, her voice smaller than it had been moments ago. "Monique, I'm sorry we showed up like this. It's just that I've been waiting so long to access Grandpa's trust, and when I finally asked the lawyer about the timeline, he mentioned you were the trustee, and I was just so confused why nobody had told me. Can we maybe come inside and talk about this calmly? I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for everything." The way she said reasonable explanation suggested she expected me to justify Grandpa's decisions, to apologize for keeping the arrangement confidential, to somehow make this entire situation more comfortable for her. The assumption that I owed her that explanation, that I owed her comfort after 5 days ago being told I was too embarrassing to attend Thanksgiving, sent a surge of something hot and unfamiliar through my veins. "We really should sit down and discuss this properly," Brian interjected smoothly, his hand making a small gesture toward my living room, as if he had any right to suggest how I used my own space. "This is clearly a complex family matter that requires some sensitive navigation. I'm sure Monique has been managing the trust responsibly, and we just need to understand what conditions need to be met for Ashley to access her inheritance. Right, Monique? There must be some conditions or timeline Grandpa established." His eyes held mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He was fishing for information while simultaneously trying to establish a rapport, positioning himself as the reasonable mediator in a family dispute he'd been part of for maybe 4 months. The presumption of it, the sheer audacity of this man who'd never met me inserting himself into the centre of family business, that predated his existence in Ashley's life was breathtaking. "I'm happy to discuss the trust," I said slowly, and watched them all lean in slightly, their attention sharpening like predators scenting prey. "But I'm curious about something first. 5 days ago, I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving because my job would embarrass Ashley in front of you, Brian. My existence was apparently too shameful to be displayed at a family dinner. Now you're all on my porch asking to come inside and have a calm discussion. What changed?" The silence that followed my question was thick with discomfort. Ashley's face flushed red. My mother suddenly found something fascinating about her shoes. My father cleared his throat, but said nothing. Only Brian maintained his composure, though I saw a flicker of something irritation maybe, or respect, for calling out the hypocrisy so directly across his features before his smooth mask returned. "That was a misunderstanding," Brian said, his tone carefully measured. "Ashley was anxious about me meeting the family for the first time, and sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're nervous. I'm sure she regrets the way that conversation went." He was answering for Ashley, I noted. She hadn't defended herself or apologised directly. Instead, she stood there looking miserable and letting her boyfriend of 4 months explain away the deep cut she'd delivered through our mother's voice. "Actually," my mother jumped in, clearly eager to move past this uncomfortable topic, "I think there might have been some confusion about what Ashley actually said. Things get lost in translation sometimes, you know how it is. The important thing is we're all here now and we can clear everything up. Your family, Monique. You'll always be family." There it was, the magical invocation of family, the word they wielded like a shield whenever they needed something from me, but seemed to forget entirely when it came to extending care or consideration in my direction. I was family when they needed help moving furniture, when they needed someone to handle logistics, when they needed money. And apparently, I was family again now that they knew I controlled $25 million. But I hadn't been family enough to warrant an invitation to Thanksgiving. That truth sat between us like a stone, undeniable, no matter how much they tried to smooth it over with convenient revisionist history. I looked at each of them in turn, my mother with her false brightness, my father with his awkward discomfort, Ashley with her red-rimmed eyes, and Brian with his calculating patience. And I felt something crack open inside me, something that had been compressed and contained for so long, I'd almost forgotten it existed. It was anger, yes, but it was more than that. It was clarity. It was the absolute refusal to continue playing a role that required me to pretend I didn't notice how completely their treatment of me shifted based on what they needed from me in any given moment. And I realised I was done being silent. "Step inside," I said, finally moving back from the doorway. Not because I wanted them in my space, but because this conversation was going to get heated, and I didn't need my neighbours witnessing whatever was about to unfold. They filed in with varying degrees of relief and apprehension. My mother immediately perching on the edge of my sofa, as if afraid to get too comfortable, my father standing awkwardly near the bookshelf, Ashley hovering by the door like she might need to escape, and Brian taking position in the centre of my living room as if he owned it. I think we can all agree this situation has gotten off on the wrong foot. Brian started clearly appointing himself spokesperson, despite having exactly zero authority to do so. "The main issue here is communication. Monique, you've been managing this trust for 5 years without telling the family. That's created a lot of confusion and hurt feelings. I was following Grandpa's explicit instructions." I said, remaining standing while they arranged themselves around my furniture. Something about staying on my feet felt important, like sitting would signal a return to the old dynamics, where I made myself smaller to accommodate their comfort. The trust documents specifically state that the trustee arrangement is confidential unless I choose to disclose it. "But we're family," my mother protested, her voice taking on that wounded quality she used when she wanted to make someone feel guilty. "Surely Grandpa didn't mean you should keep something this significant from your own parents. We had a right to know." "Did I have a right to know I was being uninvited from Thanksgiving?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. Or does the concept of rights only apply when it comes to money? My father shifted uncomfortably. Ashley looked at the floor. My mother's face tightened with displeasure at having her own logic turned back on her. That's not relevant right now. Brian cut in smoothly, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. What matters is moving forward. Ashley is 32 years old, financially independent, and certainly mature enough to manage her own inheritance. The trust should be released to her immediately. Whatever conditions Grandpa set 5 years ago, Ashley has clearly grown and changed since then. Has she? I looked directly at my sister, who still wouldn't meet my eyes. Ashley, when's the last time you checked your credit score? She mumbled something I couldn't hear. I'm sorry, what was that? I don't know, she said, more clearly, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. I don't really pay attention to that stuff. Brian handles most of our financial planning. You're not married, I pointed out. You've been dating for 4 months. Why is he handling your financial planning? We're partners, Brian said, his smooth tone developing a slight edge. We're building a life together. It makes sense to coordinate our financial strategies. The trust has specific conditions. I continued, pulling out my phone and opening the documents I kept stored there. Ashley must maintain a credit score above 650. Her current score is 573. She must keep total debt below $5,000. According to the most recent credit report I pulled last month, as part of my trustee duties, she currently carries $47,000 in debt across 8 credit cards and 2 personal loans. Ashley's face went pale. My parents exchanged shocked looks. That can't be right, my mother said weakly. Ashley, you told us you were doing fine financially. I am fine, Ashley snapped, finding her voice suddenly. Those numbers are temporary. I had some unexpected expenses and I'm working on paying things down. It's not like I'm irresponsible or anything. The third condition, I continued as if she hadn't spoken, is completion of a financial literacy course. Grandpa left specific recommendations for programs he felt would be valuable. Ashley hasn't enrolled in any of them. This is ridiculous, Brian said, and now the smooth mask was definitely cracking, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. These conditions are arbitrary and outdated. Ashley doesn't need a financial literacy course, she has me. I work in private equity. I manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions. The idea that she needs some basic course designed for people who don't understand money is frankly insulting. The conditions aren't arbitrary, I said calmly, though my heart was racing. They're Grandpa's wishes clearly stated in legally binding documents, and they're not subject to negotiation or a revision based on who Ashley is currently dating. But they should be, Brian pressed, taking a step closer to me in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. Circumstances change. People grow. What made sense 5 years ago might not make sense now. We should get a second legal opinion, see if there's grounds to challenge these outdated requirements. Any reasonable judge would see that Ashley is perfectly capable of managing her inheritance, especially with professional guidance. The word "we" hung in the air, heavy with presumption. He'd been dating my sister for 4 months, and he was already talking about challenging my grandfather's will, about overriding the careful conditions a dying man had set to protect his granddaughter from exactly this kind of person. Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing, I said, meeting Brian's eyes and not backing down from the challenge I saw there. The trust is ironclad. I've had 5 years to review it with multiple lawyers. There are no loopholes, no grounds for challenge, no way to circumvent the conditions. Ashley gets access to the money when she meets the requirements, not before. So you're just going to hold it hostage? Ashley's voice climbed higher, taking on that edge of hysteria she'd always been able to deploy when things didn't go her way. You're going to lord this over me forever, making me jump through hoops while you live in your little house pretending to be poor. Is this some kind of sick power trip for you? I'm not pretending anything, I said quietly. I live exactly how I choose to live, and I'm not holding anything hostage. I'm executing Grandpa's wishes as trustee. If you want access to the money, meet the conditions. It's that simple. Simple, my mother said bitterly. Nothing about this is simple, Monique. You've had control of your sister's future for 5 years and never said a word. You've let us worry about Ashley's finances, help her when she was struggling, all while sitting on the knowledge that there was a massive safety net waiting. How is that not cruel? Was it cruel when you uninvited me from Thanksgiving? I asked. Or does cruelty only count when it affects you? That's when Ashley burst into tears and started screaming. You've always been jealous of me. Ashley's voice cracked into something raw and desperate, tears streaming down her face in a way that would have looked genuine if I hadn't seen this performance dozens of times over the years. You couldn't stand that Mum and Dad loved me more, that I was prettier and more successful and actually had a life. So the second you got any power over me, you took it, and you've been enjoying it ever since. The accusation hung in the air, so absurd and yet so perfectly Ashley that I almost laughed. Here she stood, the recipient of every advantage our family could provide, crying because for once in her life there was something she couldn't have immediately. That's not, my mother started, but Ashley whirled on her. Don't defend her. She's been sitting on $25 million that Grandpa left for me, and she never said anything. She watched me struggle and stress about money, and she just smiled and kept it all secret because she finally had something I didn't have. Power, control, the ability to make me beg. I've never asked you to beg, I said, my voice level. I've never even mentioned the trust. You found out about it on your own by asking the lawyer questions. Because you were hiding it, Ashley shrieked. You're a control freak who gets off on having power over people. You probably loved watching me, loved having this secret that made you better than me. Well, guess what? You're not better than me. You're just bitter and jealous and pathetic. Ashley, honey, maybe we should take a breath. My father tried, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating drama, but doing nothing to actually stop it. No, Ashley jabbed a finger in my direction, her whole body shaking with either genuine emotion or a very good imitation of it. She's not even qualified to manage that much money. What does she know about investments or trusts or financial management? She cleans houses. She's probably losing money every year through sheer incompetence or worse, stealing from it. Has anyone actually verified that the full $25 million is still there? The implication that I'd been embezzling from my own sister's trust fund was so outrageous that for a moment I couldn't even process a response. My parents notably said nothing to defend me against this accusation. They just looked at me with a new wariness in their eyes, as if Ashley's poisonous suggestion had planted a seed of doubt. The trust is audited annually by an independent accounting firm, as required by law. I said, my calm apparently more infuriating to Ashley than any emotional response would have been. Every transaction is documented and reviewed. The trust has actually grown to $27.3 million through conservative investments over the past 5 years. You'll receive a full accounting whenever you meet the conditions and the trust is released. Oh, how convenient! Ashley spat. You have an answer for everything, don't you? You've probably been planning this for years, figuring out how to keep control forever. What happens if I never meet your impossible conditions? Do you just keep the money? Is that the plan? If the beneficiary never meets the conditions, the trust eventually passes to designated charitable organisations as specified in Grandpa's documents. I explained, though, I knew facts wouldn't penetrate the emotional storm Ashley had whipped herself into. I don't benefit either way. My role is simply to execute Grandpa's wishes. Baby, hey, look at me. Brian moved to Ashley's side, his hands gentle on her shoulders in a gesture that looked supportive but served to position himself physically between us. I know this is overwhelming. Finding out your own sister has been keeping something this huge from you. It's a betrayal. Of course you're upset. Anyone would be. He was validating her hysteria, I realised, feeding it while pretending to calm it. Each soothing word came with an embedded accusation directed at me, reframing the entire situation, so that Ashley was the victim of my cruelty rather than the beneficiary of Grandpa's careful planning. But here's what we need to focus on, Brian continued, his voice dropping into that smooth, reasonable tone that made everything he said sound logical, even when it wasn't. The trust exists. The money is there, and there must be some way to expedite the process. These conditions can't be impossible to meet if we work together and approach them strategically. There it was again, we. As if he had any claim to Ashley's inheritance, any right to be involved in these decisions at all. How long would it take to fix the credit score and pay down the debt? Brian asked, his eyes on me with that calculating intensity I was beginning to recognise as his default state. Yes, if we made that our priority, created a plan, how soon could Ashley qualify? That depends entirely on Ashley, I said. Credit repair doesn't happen overnight. Paying down $47,000 in debt takes time unless you have substantial income or savings. The financial literacy courses take 3 to 6 months to complete depending on the program. So we're talking at least a year, Brian said, and I could see him doing calculations in his head. That's a long time to wait for money that's rightfully hers. What if we structured some kind of advance? The trust could loan Ashley funds against her future inheritance to help her pay down the debt faster, which would allow her to meet the conditions sooner. That's a reasonable compromise that serves everyone's interests. The audacity of it took my breath away. He'd been in my house for less than 30 minutes, and he was already trying to find loopholes, ways to extract money from the trust before Ashley met any of the conditions Grandpa had set specifically to prevent this exact scenario. The trust documents don't allow for advances or loans, I said. And even if they did, taking on more debt to pay off existing debt isn't exactly demonstrating financial responsibility. You just want to keep control forever, Ashley said, her tears drying now that anger was taking over. Admit it. This isn't about Grandpa's wishes or conditions or any of that. This is about you finally having something over me, and you're never going to let it go. If that were true, I said quietly, you wouldn't have found out about it at all. I could have kept it secret indefinitely. The fact that you know about it now is because you asked questions, not because I wanted this confrontation. Maybe you wanted us to find out, Ashley shot back. Maybe this whole thing is part of your sick little power play. Make us come here and beg so you can feel important for once in your pathetic life. The cruelty in her voice should have hurt more than it did, but I'd moved past the point where Ashley's opinions of me mattered. I could see her so clearly now, this woman-child who'd never been told no, never had to work for anything, never developed any capacity to handle disappointment or frustration. And standing behind her was Brian Puppet Master in training, already figuring out how to use her weaknesses to his advantage. Then, Brian said something that revealed everything. Look, let's be realistic about what we're dealing with here, Brian said, his tone shifting into something more direct, more businesslike, as if he'd decided that subtlety wasn't working, and it was time to just lay out the facts. That $25 million will change our lives. It'll set us up for the future. We deserve the life Ashley's always been meant to have. We can't let arbitrary conditions stand in the way of that. Our lives. The word hung in the room like a confession he didn't even realise he'd made. Not Ashley's life. Not her future. 4 months of dating, and he'd already mentally claimed ownership of an inheritance that wasn't his money. He had exactly zero legal right to a future he'd inserted himself into with stunning presumption. I saw the moment register on my parents' faces, the slight widening of eyes, the microscopic shift in posture that suggested doubt creeping in. Even my mother, who'd been so caught up in the drama and the promise of family wealth, seemed to pause at the casual way Brian had appropriated Ashley's inheritance into a shared asset. But Ashley, I noticed, didn't react at all. Either she'd heard him talk this way before and it seemed like normal to her, or she was so desperate for his support that she'd accept any terms he set. Neither possibility suggested good things about their relationship. "You've been dating my sister for 4 months," I said, making sure to emphasize the timeline. "That money isn't yours. It's not our money. It's Ashley's inheritance if and when she meets the conditions Grandpa set for her specifically." "We're partners," Brian said, and there was a flash of irritation in his eyes at being challenged. "When you're building a life with someone, you make decisions together. Ashley and I have plans, investment opportunities, property purchases, building the kind of portfolio that will secure our financial future. That $25 million is the foundation we need to make those plans reality. Our financial future. Investment opportunities he'd already identified. Plans that required access to Ashley's money. Each word revealed more of the calculation that had been running since the moment he'd learned about the trust. This wasn't a man who'd accidentally stumbled into a relationship that happened to come with a substantial inheritance. This was someone who'd done the math and seen dollar signs where there should have been a person. What kind of investment opportunities? I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the alarm bells screaming in my head. "Private equity deals primarily," Brian said, warming to the topic with an enthusiasm that confirmed this wasn't hypothetical. He'd been planning this, preparing for the moment when Ashley's money became accessible. "I have access to investments that require significant capital buy-in, the kind of opportunities that turn $25 million into $50 million within 5 years, if you know what you're doing. But they're time sensitive. We can't afford to wait a year or more while Ashley jumps through hoops for conditions that don't even make sense in today's market. So, your plan is to take Ashley's inheritance and immediately risk it in aggressive investments," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's not risk when you have insider knowledge and proven track record," Brian countered. "That's the problem with people who don't understand wealth. They're afraid of the very strategies that build real money. Ashley deserves better than having her inheritance sit in whatever conservative investments you've probably locked it into. She deserves to see that money grow into something truly significant." What he meant, I understood, was that he deserved access to that capital for his own ventures. Ashley was just the convenient vehicle for his ambitions. "The trust is Ashley's safety net," I said, carefully watching my sister's face for any sign that she recognised what was happening. "It was designed to provide long-term security, not to fund speculative investments or someone else's business opportunities." "That's exactly the kind of small-minded thinking that keeps people poor," Brian said, and now there was open contempt in his voice. "No wonder you're still cleaning houses instead of building real wealth. You don't understand how money actually works at this level." The insult was designed to put me back in the box of someone too unsophisticated to understand his brilliant financial strategies. What he didn't know was that my small-minded thinking had turned my initial investments into substantial passive income without ever risking money I couldn't afford to lose. "Brian's right," Ashley said, finding her voice now that her boyfriend was taking charge. "You don't understand this world. Brian went to Wharton. He's worked with billion-dollar portfolios. He knows how to make money work for you, not just sit there doing nothing." "And how exactly did you meet Brian?" I asked, the question occurring to me for the first time. Ashley flushed, confirming my suspicion that there was a story there she didn't want to share. "That's not relevant," Brian said quickly. "What matters is that we're together now and we're planning a future that requires capital. Ashley's capital, which is being held hostage by conditions that made sense maybe for a 25-year-old, but are insulting for a mature woman with professional guidance." Professional guidance. That's how he saw himself. Not as a boyfriend, not as a partner in the emotional sense, but as Ashley's financial advisor, who happened to also be sleeping with his client. The cynicism of it was breathtaking. "Even if Ashley meets all the conditions tomorrow," I said, "the trust will remain in her name alone. It's not marital property, you're not married. It's not joint assets, you have no legal relationship to the money. As trustee, I'd ensure that's protected. Something dangerous flickered across Brian's face, quickly suppressed but visible enough that I knew I'd hit a nerve. He'd assumed I realised that once Ashley had access to the money, she'd simply do whatever he suggested. The idea that I might continue to have oversight, that there might be protections built in even after the conditions were met, hadn't occurred to him. "We'll see about that when the time comes," he said, and the threat was barely veiled. "I'm sure once Ashley has proper legal representation, we'll find that your role as trustee can be adjusted to reflect current circumstances." "Brian," my mother said hesitantly, speaking for the first time since his slip about our money, "don't you think this is all moving a bit fast? I mean, you and Ashley are still getting to know each other. Maybe it would be better to take things slowly with the financial planning." "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson," Brian said, and his smile didn't reach his eyes, "Ashley is an adult who can make her own decisions about her own money. She doesn't need her mother's permission or her sister's approval to access what's rightfully hers." The dismissal of my mother was sharp enough that even she recoiled slightly. This was a man who'd charm and manipulate when it served his purposes, but who would show his true nature the moment anyone stood between him and what he wanted. And what he wanted, with a clarity that chilled me, was Ashley's $25 million. I decided I would not stay silent anymore. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, and the authority in my own voice surprised even me. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 5 years managing millions of dollars, making difficult decisions and carrying responsibilities nobody knew about. It was the voice of the person I'd been in private, finally emerging in front of my family. "Ashley, you're going to provide me with complete financial documentation, current statements for all bank accounts, all credit cards, all loans, a copy of your most recent credit report, tax returns for the past 3 years. Everything." Ashley's mouth fell open. "You can't just demand—" "I absolutely can. I interrupted something I'd never done to her in our entire lives. I'm the trustee of your inheritance. It's not only my right to review your financial situation, it's my legal obligation. Grandpa's conditions require you to demonstrate financial responsibility, and I need to see exactly where you stand right now. Not the vague picture you've painted, not what Brian thinks your situation is. The actual facts." "This is outrageous," Brian started, but I turned to him with a look that stopped him mid-sentence. "You have no standing in this discussion," I said flatly. "You're not family, you're not a beneficiary, you're not a trustee, you're Ashley's boyfriend of 4 months. Your opinion on how I execute my responsibilities is irrelevant." The room went deadly quiet. My father looked stunned. My mother's hand had moved to her throat in that gesture she made when she was shocked. Ashley seemed frozen, unable to process this version of her sister, who pushed back, who set boundaries, who refused to be steamrolled. "While we're laying out facts," I continued, my eyes on Ashley now, "let's talk about financial responsibility. 2 years ago, you borrowed $3,000 from Mom and Dad for what you said was a security deposit on a new apartment. A month later, you posted Instagram photos of yourself in Cabo with designer luggage that cost more than the loan. The apartment deposit story was a lie." Ashley's face flushed red. "I needed a vacation. I was stressed. 3 years ago, you maxed out a credit card and asked me to co-sign on a new one to help you rebuild credit. I said no, and you didn't speak to me for 6 months. You told everyone I was selfish and unsupportive. What you didn't tell them was that you'd maxed that first card buying furniture for a boyfriend who dumped you 3 weeks later." "Those were difficult times," my mother said weakly. Ashley was going through emotional struggles. "Last year," I pressed on, "you borrowed $1,500 from Dad for what you claimed was a medical emergency. I saw the charges later when you used my Amazon account to buy designer clothes because yours was maxed out. No medical bills, just shopping." "How dare you go through my purchases? Ashley hissed. You used my account, I reminded her, and you never paid Dad back. You never pay anyone back because you've been raised to believe that money just appears when you need it, that there are no consequences for irresponsibility, that someone will always catch you when you fall. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't uncomfortable pause, this was the heavy quiet of people being forced to confront truths they'd been willfully ignoring. Grandpa saw all of this. I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. He watched you drift through your 20s, expecting life to provide without effort. He watched Mum and Dad enable it, watched you learn nothing from your mistakes because you were never allowed to experience real consequences. And he loved you enough to try to break that cycle. By punishing her, my mother asked. By making her jump through hoops. By giving her a reason to grow up, I corrected. The conditions aren't punishment, they're a path. Prove you can manage credit responsibly. Prove you can live within your means. Prove you're willing to learn what you don't know. Do those things and the money is yours. But it's so much money, Ashley said, and her voice had lost its sharp edge, becoming something smaller and more desperate. I could pay off all my debts immediately and start fresh. Why make me struggle when the solution is sitting right there? Because that's not starting fresh, I said. That's just erasing the consequences of your choices without learning anything. You'd have $25 million and the same spending habits that got you $47,000 in debt. In 5 years, maybe less, you'd be broke again. And this time, there wouldn't be another inheritance waiting. Brian made a sound of derision. That's absurd. With proper investment strategies, your investment strategies require capital. I cut him off. Ashley's capital, which she hasn't earned, hasn't built, and hasn't demonstrated any ability to protect. No ethical financial advisor would recommend immediately risking inherited wealth in aggressive investments, especially not for someone with no financial literacy and a history of poor money management. I have financial literacy, Ashley protested weakly. Name your current credit score, I said. Silence. How much interest are you paying monthly on your credit card debt? More silence. What's the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA? Ashley looked at Brian desperately as if he could feed her the answers, but I shook my head. This is exactly what Grandpa was afraid of. You're 32 years old and you don't know the basics of personal finance. That's not your fault. Nobody ever required you to learn. But it is your responsibility now. So what are you saying? My father asked. That Ashley can never access the money. I'm saying the conditions stand, I replied. They're not negotiable. They won't be changed by a lawyer, altered by a judge, or circumvented by creative interpretation. Grandpa wrote them into the trust with precisely this scenario in mind, people trying to pressure the trustee into releasing funds before the beneficiary is ready. The trust is ironclad. I've had 5 years and 3 different law firms review it. There are no loopholes. I let that sink in, watching realization dawn on each face. This wasn't something they could charm or manipulate their way around. This wasn't me being difficult or stubborn. This was legal reality backed by documents that had been crafted by one of the best estate attorneys in the state. However, I continued, I'm willing to work with Ashley if she's serious about meeting the conditions. I can recommend financial advisors who specialize in credit repair and debt management. I can help create a realistic timeline and budget. But that requires honesty and effort from Ashley, not tantrums and accusations. This is so unfair, Ashley said, but her voice lacked conviction now. She was beginning to understand that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted, that her usual strategies weren't going to work. Send me the financial documents I requested, I said. All of them within 3 days. Once I have a complete picture of your situation, we'll meet again and discuss a realistic path forward. 3 days later, Ashley's financial records revealed something shocking. The email arrived late on a Tuesday evening, with no message in the body, just a string of PDF attachments, bank statements, credit card bills, loan documentation, tax returns. Ashley had included everything I'd requested, and probably more than she'd wanted me to see. I poured out myself a glass of wine and settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, preparing to spend the next few hours understanding exactly how deep my sister's financial hole went. The credit cards were bad, but not surprising. 8 accounts all carrying balances, most of them at or near their limits. The interest rates were predatory, ranging from 19% to 28%, the kind of numbers that meant she was paying hundreds of dollars monthly just in finance charges, while barely touching the principal. I added up the balances with a sinking feeling, $32,000 across those 8 cards alone. The personal loans were worse. 2 different lending companies, both of them the kind that advertised on late-night television, with promises of easy approval and no credit checks. Together, they totaled another $12,000, with interest rates that should have been illegal. The monthly payments on those alone had to be crushing her budget, assuming she even had a budget. But it was the bank statements that made me stop cold. I'd been scanning through routine transactions, groceries, gas, the occasional restaurant charge when a single line item caught my eye. $15,000 transferred out 3 months ago to something called BC Consulting LLC. It was by far the largest transaction in months, and there was no corresponding deposit or explanation. I opened a new browser tab and typed BC Consulting LLC into Google. The search returned dozens of consulting firms, business coaches, and generic corporate entities, but none that matched the address listed on Ashley's transfer. I tried the address itself, a street in downtown that I recognised as a mixed residential and commercial area. Nothing. No business registered at that location, no website, no online presence whatsoever. My hands move faster now, instinct taking over. I pulled up the state's business entity database and searched for BC Consulting LLC. It existed registered 8 months ago, but the registration address wasn't a business address. It was an apartment. And when I cross-referenced that address with Brian's social media history, I found photos he'd posted a year ago with geotags matching that exact location. It was his old apartment before he'd moved, presumably around the time he'd started dating Ashley. The implications crystallized with sickening clarity. Brian had created a shell company, convinced Ashley to transfer $15,000 to it under the guise of an investment opportunity, and that money had gone directly to him. This wasn't just opportunistic gold digging, this was fraud. I reached for my phone and called Ashley. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice wary. "Did you get everything you needed?" "I need to ask you about something," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's a $15,000 transfer to BC Consulting LLC from 3 months ago. Can you tell me what that was for?" There was a pause. "Oh, that was an investment Brian set up for us. He said it was a private consulting deal that would double our money within 6 months, like a finder's fee situation for connecting clients or something. I didn't really understand all the details, but Brian handles that kind of thing." "Did you get any documentation?" I asked. "A contract? A prospectus? Anything in writing?" I think Brian has all that. He said it was better to keep the paperwork in one place since he was managing it. Why?" I closed my eyes, debating how much to tell her right now. "Ashley, I can't find any record of BC Consulting LLC operating as a legitimate business. The address it's registered to is Brian's old apartment." The silence on the other end stretched so long, I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "That doesn't mean anything. Maybe he runs it out of his home. Lots of people do that." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. "But I need you to ask Brian for the documentation. The contract you signed, any updates on the investment, where the money is now. Can you do that?" "You're just trying to make him look bad," Ashley said, but there was no conviction in her accusation. "You've hated him from the moment you met him." "I met him 3 days ago when he showed up at my door demanding I release your trust fund," I reminded her. "And I'm not trying to make him look bad, I'm trying to protect you. $15,000 is a significant amount of money, and you have a right to know exactly where it is and what it's doing." I heard her breathing on the other end, quick and shallow. "It's probably fine. Brian wouldn't lie to me about something like this." "Then, proving it should be easy," I said gently. "Just ask him for the paperwork. If everything is legitimate, he'll have no problem showing you the documentation." "Fine," Ashley said, and ended the call abruptly. I sat staring at my laptop screen at the transfer that represented $15,000 of debt Ashley had taken on for an investment that almost certainly didn't exist. Brian had seen a woman with poor financial literacy and a massive inheritance on the horizon, and he'd started extracting money immediately while positioning himself for the bigger prize. The $47,000 in debt wasn't just the result of Ashley's poor choices. Some significant portion of it was the direct result of Brian's manipulation. And if he'd done this once, if he'd successfully convinced her to hand over $15,000 for a fake investment, what would he do when she had access to $25 million? I thought about my sister, who for all her flaws and all our complicated history was still my sister. I thought about her sitting in whatever apartment she shared with Brian, trying to convince herself that the man she loved wasn't scamming her, wasn't seeing her as nothing more than a paycheck he was waiting to collect. I thought about how she'd react when the truth became undeniable, how it would crush her to realise she'd been used. But I also thought about what would happen if I did nothing. If I let this play out, let Brian continue his manipulation until he'd extracted everything he could from Ashley's life. The trust conditions suddenly seemed less like obstacles and more like the lifeline they were meant to be, Grandpa's way of keeping the money out of reach until Ashley had developed the judgment to protect herself and it. I decided it was time to investigate Brian properly. 2 days after discovering the BC Consulting transfer, I found myself sitting in my parents' living room for what they'd insisted should be a family discussion about moving forward productively. The investigator I'd hired was working on a full background check for Brian, but results would take at least a week. In the meantime, I decided that if we were going to have honest conversations about financial responsibility, it was time to address the lies my family had been telling themselves about me. They were all there again. Mum and Dad on the sofa, Ashley perched nervously on the armchair, and Brian standing by the window with studied casualness that didn't quite hide his tension. I'd asked Ashley privately if she'd requested the BC Consulting documentation from Brian. She changed the subject. "Thank you all for meeting." I started remaining standing while they arranged themselves around the room. "I've reviewed Ashley's financial records, and I have thoughts about a realistic path forward. But first, I think we need to address something that's been hanging over all of these conversations." "What's that?" my mother asked, her tone careful. "The reason I was uninvited from Thanksgiving," I said, watching Ashley flush. "My allegedly embarrassing life that would reflect poorly on this family in front of Brian. My blue-collar jobs and modest lifestyle that supposedly indicate failure or lack of ambition. I think it's time we were honest about what my life actually looks like." "Monique, we don't need to rehash, my father started. "I own 3 properties, I interrupted. "A duplex I bought when I was 24 that's now fully paid off and generates $2,400 monthly in rental income. A small apartment building I purchased at 27 that produces another $3,800 monthly after expenses. And this house, which I bought outright 3 years ago with cash." The room went silent. My mother's mouth had fallen open slightly. My father looked like he was trying to recalculate everything he thought he knew about me. "In addition," I continued, "I have an investment portfolio worth approximately $480,000 diversified across index funds, bonds, and some individual stocks. My blue-collar work, the house cleaning, the handyman jobs, generates about $25,000 a year, which covers my personal expenses and gives me flexible hours. But that's supplementary income, not necessity. My passive income from properties and investments is roughly $75,000 annually. That's not possible, Ashley said weakly. You clean houses. I choose to clean houses, I corrected. Because I enjoy physical work, I like the flexibility, and I don't need to prove my worth through a corporate job title. Mrs. Patterson, whose house I clean every Wednesday, she's a retired financial advisor who's taught me more about investing than any MBA program could. The Johnsons, whose plumbing I fix, he's a real estate attorney who's reviewed every one of my property purchases pro bono because he appreciates good work. Why didn't you ever tell us? My mother asked, and for the first time I heard something like hurt beneath the shock. Because you never asked, I said simply. When I bought my first property, I mentioned it at dinner. Dad said that sounded risky and changed the subject to Ashley's new apartment that you were helping her furnish. When I completed my property management certification, I brought it up and Mum said that was nice, but wouldn't I rather go back to school for something more stable? Every achievement I mentioned was minimised or dismissed, so I stopped mentioning them. That's not fair, my mother protested. We were just concerned about you, trying to protect you from making mistakes. You were projecting your own fears onto my choices, I said. You assumed that because I wasn't following a traditional path, I must be struggling. It was easier to see me as the responsible but unsuccessful daughter than to acknowledge that I'd built something substantial while Ashley was burning through your money and her own credit. I watched my words land, saw my parents' faces cycle through denial and recognition and uncomfortable acceptance. They'd constructed a narrative about their two daughters, one successful and delicate, one sturdy and struggling, and they'd held on to that narrative despite mounting evidence to the contrary, because it justified their unequal treatment. But it was Brian's reaction that caught my attention. While my parents processed their misconceptions and Ashley looked between us with growing confusion, Brian's expression had shifted into something else entirely. His eyes had sharpened with interest, and he was looking at me the way he'd looked at Ashley when discussing the trust, calculating, assessing, seeing opportunity where others saw a person. That's actually impressive, Brian said, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine admiration. Building that kind of portfolio by your early 30s with no family support that takes real financial acumen. The kind of knowledge and experience that would be invaluable in managing a larger portfolio, say $25 million. There it was. The pivot. Now that I wasn't just the embarrassing sister, but someone with demonstrated financial success, I'd shifted from obstacle to potential ally in his mind. Which is exactly why Grandpa trusted me as trustee, I said, meeting his eyes steadily. He knew I understood money, understood restraint, and understood the difference between building wealth and gambling with it. Of course, Brian said smoothly. And that experience means you'd recognize a genuine investment opportunity when you saw one. Someone with your background would appreciate the kind of private equity deals I mentioned earlier. We should talk about that, actually. Maybe not about Ashley's trust specifically, but about your own portfolio. I could introduce you to some opportunities that might interest someone at your level. And there it was, the attempt to bring me into his circle, to make me feel special and sophisticated, to create an alliance that would eventually lead to access to Ashley's money. It was smoothly done, almost convincing if I hadn't already seen the BC Consulting LLC fraud in Ashley's bank records. I'm happy with my current investment strategy, I said. Conservative, steady, and mind to control completely. Something flickered across Brian's face. Frustration maybe, or irritation that I hadn't taken the bait. But he recovered quickly, that smooth mask sliding back into place. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind, he said. It's rare to meet someone who really understands wealth building. Most people in your position would have been content with one rental property and a steady paycheck. The fact that you pushed for more, built more, shows real ambition. My mother was nodding along, apparently pleased that Brian was finally seeing my value. Ashley looked troubled, though I couldn't tell if it was because her sister had more financial success than she'd known, or because her boyfriend was suddenly very interested in that success. My father cleared his throat. "I think we owe you an apology, Monique. We've clearly underestimated what you've accomplished. That was wrong of us." It was the closest to accountability I'd ever gotten from him, and it should have felt satisfying. But I was watching Brian watch me, seeing the wheels turning behind his polished facade, and I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. Brian's expression told me I'd just made a dangerous mistake. The email from the investigator arrived on Sunday morning while I was drinking coffee and pretending to read a book I'd been staring at for an hour without absorbing a single word. The subject line was simply Brian Matthews investigation, urgent, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. I'd paid for the premium background check, the kind that went deeper than standard searches, that looked for patterns across states and aliases, that pulled court records and interviewed previous associates when possible. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Chen, who specialized in financial fraud cases, had warned me it might take up to 2 weeks. He delivered in 5 days, which told me he'd found something significant enough to prioritize. The report was 37 pages long. I started reading and felt my blood turn cold by page 3. Brian Matthews wasn't his original name. He'd been born Brian Mitchell Patterson in Ohio 41 years ago, not the 36 he claimed. His first arrest came at age 29 for credit card fraud, a relatively minor offence that got him probation and community service. But it was what came after that painted the real picture. In 2015, operating under the name Brandon Maxwell, he'd been convicted of defrauding a 52-year-old widow in Arizona out of $80,000. He'd met her through a church singles group, courted her for 6 months, gained access to her accounts under the guise of helping her manage her late husband's estate, and systematically drained her savings before disappearing. She discovered the theft when she tried to make a down payment on a smaller house and found her accounts empty. He'd served 18 months in prison. Less than a year after his release in 2018, he'd done it again. This time as Brian Matheson in Nevada, targeting a 63-year-old woman he'd met on a dating app for mature singles. Same pattern, whirlwind romance, quick talk of marriage and combined futures, access to her finances for investment opportunities, and vanishing act once he'd extracted $130,000. This time he'd been caught faster, received a 3-year sentence, and been released early for good behaviour just over 2 years ago. The investigator had found evidence of at least 12 other women across 6 states who'd filed police reports matching Brian's MO, though charges had never been filed either because evidence was insufficient or the women declined to prosecute out of embarrassment. The amounts ranged from $15,000 to $200,000. His victims shared profiles middle-aged or older, financially comfortable, but not sophisticated about money recently. Single through divorce or widowhood, lonely and looking for companionship. He'd used 14 different names that the investigator could confirm. He changed his appearance slightly between identities, grew a beard or shaved it, changed his hair, adjusted his wardrobe and accent to match whatever persona he was selling. But the pattern never varied. Identify, target, establish, romantic relationship, gain, financial access, extract maximum amount possible, disappear before consequences caught up. What made my hands start shaking was the current section of the report. Chen had found evidence that Brian was actively working with multiple potential victims, simultaneously maintaining relationships with at least 3 women, in addition to Ashley. He rotated between them geographically, spending a few weeks with one before moving to another, keeping each woman believing she was his primary focus, while he maximized his extraction opportunities across all of them. One of those names was listed as Susan Wilson, age 58, widow, last known contact 3 weeks ago in the city where my parents lived. My mother's friend, Susan, the widow who'd lost her husband 2 years ago and had struggled with loneliness ever since. The woman my mother had mentioned just weeks ago was finally dating again, someone wonderful she'd met through an online community for people who'd lost spouses. I read that name 3 times, my vision tunneling, until it was the only thing I could see on the screen. Susan Wilson. The investigator had included a last known address that I recognised as being maybe 2 miles from my parents' house. He'd noted that Susan had already transferred $60,000 to an account controlled by Brian under the name Mark Williams for what she believed was a real estate investment opportunity. She'd taken a home equity loan to do it. The report noted that Brian's current approach was more sophisticated than his earlier attempts. He was working longer timelines, building more elaborate cover stories, and most critically, he was targeting women with connections to each other. Ashley wasn't random. She was the sister of someone managing a $25 million trust. Susan wasn't random. She was close friends with Ashley's mother, providing both a secondary income source and potential leverage or information about the family dynamics. This wasn't opportunistic fraud anymore. This was systematic, calculated. And he'd been planning it for months before he ever showed up at my parents' Thanksgiving dinner. Meeting Ashley, courting her, positioning himself, all of it had been strategic. And now that he knew about my own financial situation, I'd likely moved from obstacle to potential target as well. The final page of the report contained Chen's assessment and recommendations. His conclusion was stark. Subject demonstrates sophisticated predatory patterns consistent with career fraud specialists. His escalation from single victims to connected networks suggests increasing confidence and ambition. The proximity to a high-valued target, the 20-20 trust combined with multiple connected secondary targets. Ashley, Susan possibly. Monique indicates this is likely his most ambitious operation to date. Recommend immediate intervention and coordination with law enforcement. Subject has proven willing to maintain deceptions for extended periods and shows no evidence of genuine emotional attachment to victims. All relationships appear purely transactional. I sat frozen, the coffee going cold in my hand, my mind racing through implications. Ashley wasn't in a relationship, she was the mark in a long con. Susan wasn't finding companionship, she was being systematically robbed. And my family had welcomed this predator into our lives, given him access to information and trust and opportunity because Ashley wanted to bring her boyfriend to Thanksgiving. The $60,000 Susan had already given him. The $15,000 from Ashley. How much more had he extracted that I didn't know about yet? How much was he planning to take, and how far would he go to get access to that $25 million, now that he knew it existed, and knew that I was the only thing standing between him and the biggest score of his career? I grabbed my phone and called my mother immediately. My mother answered on the 4th ring, slightly breathless. "Monique, is everything all right? You sound upset." "Mom, your friend Susan," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the panic clawing at my chest. "The one who's been dating someone new. What's his name?" "Oh, Susan's boyfriend." My mother's tone brightened, clearly pleased to discuss something positive rather than family conflict. "Mark something. Williams, I think." "Why?" My stomach plummeted even though I'd known what she was going to say. Mark Williams, one of Brian's confirmed aliases. How long have they been seeing each other? About 5 months, I think. Maybe 6. Susan met him through one of those online support groups for people who've lost spouses. She was so lonely after Richard died, and Mark has just been wonderful for her. Very attentive, always making her feel special. She seems happier than she's been in years. 5 or 6 months. He'd been working Susan even longer than he'd been with Ashley. "Mom, I need Susan's phone number right now." "What's this about?" The brightness in my mother's voice faded into concern. "Monique, you're scaring me. Just give me her number, please. I'll explain everything, but I need to talk to her immediately." My mother rattled off the number, her questions continuing, even as I thanked her and ended the call. I pulled up Facebook on my laptop and searched for Susan Wilson, finding her profile within seconds. Her privacy settings were loose, the kind of setting that came from not really understanding social media security. Her recent photos were public, including several from the past few months. There he was, Brian, his arm around Susan's shoulders, both of them smiling at a restaurant. The caption read, "Finally found my person," with a heart emoji. Another photo showed them at what looked like a charity gala, Brian in a tuxedo, looking every inch the successful professional he claimed to be. Susan's comments on these photos gushed about how lucky she felt, how Mark had restored her faith in love, how grateful she was to have found him. The dates on the photos confirmed he'd been seeing Susan for at least 6 months, which meant he'd started courting her before he ever met Ashley. This wasn't a backup plan. Susan was the original target, or at least one of several he'd been working simultaneously. Ashley, with her inheritance connection, had probably been the upgrade opportunity that came along later. I dialed Susan's number, my heart hammering. She answered after 3 rings, her voice warm but cautious. "Hello?" "Susan, hi, this is Monique Henderson, Carol's daughter. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I need to talk to you about Mark." The warmth vanished instantly. "I don't know what Carol told you, but—" "She didn't tell me anything negative," I interrupted. "But I've discovered some information about Mark Williams that you need to know. He's not who he says he is." "Excuse me," Susan's voice went cold. "I don't appreciate you calling me to spread rumours about my relationship. Whatever issues you have with your own life—" "Susan, please listen. Mark Williams isn't his real name. His real name is Brian Matthews, and he has 2 prior convictions for financial fraud. He targets women, exactly like you, widows, with assets, and he's done this to at least a dozen other women across multiple states." "That's ridiculous," Susan snapped. "Mark is a successful real estate investor. He's kind and generous, and he loves me. I know exactly what this is about. Carol mentioned that you're having some family problems, some jealousy issues with your sister. Well, I'm not going to be dragged into your drama." The words hit me like a physical blow. Brian had prepared for this. He'd already been planting seeds, already been positioning me as someone unstable or jealous or problematic, so that when the truth came out, Susan wouldn't believe it. "Susan, have you given him money?" I asked directly. "For investments or business opportunities or any other reason?" The silence on the other end was answer enough. "How much?" I pressed. "That's none of your business," Susan said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "Mark is helping me invest my money wisely, something you probably wouldn't understand since you clean houses for a living." There it was, another one of Brian's poison seeds. He'd told Susan about me, painted me as unsuccessful or unsophisticated, created a narrative where any warning I might give would be dismissed as jealousy or ignorance. "I own 3 rental properties and have a portfolio worth almost $500,000, I said flatly. "And I'm telling you that whatever investment Mark has sold you on is a fraud. The company doesn't exist. The returns he's promising won't materialize. He will take your money and disappear just like he did to women in Arizona and Nevada and 4 other states." "You're lying," Susan said, but doubt had crept into her voice. "Mark showed me the business documents, the investment prospectus. Everything looked legitimate." "They always do," I said gently. "That's how con artists work. Susan, please just do one thing for me. Google Brian Patterson Fraud Arizona 2015. Look at the photos from the court case. Then tell me that's not the same man who's dating you as Mark Williams." "I don't need to Google anything," Susan said, but she sounded less certain now. "Mark told me you might try something like this. He said your family was upset about him dating Ashley, and that you'd probably try to turn people against him. He warned me you might even call with some made-up story about his past." Of course he had. He'd anticipated every move, prepared Susan to reject any evidence before she even heard it. The sophistication of his manipulation was breathtaking and terrifying. "He's also dating my sister Ashley," I said. "Right now, at the same time he's dating you. He calls himself Brian when he's with her. You're not his girlfriend, Susan. You're one of several women he's actively defrauding simultaneously. That's insane, Susan said, but her voice cracked. You're making this up because you're bitter. Not everyone ends up alone like you, Monique. Some of us find happiness. The cruelty of that line, which had to have come directly from Brian's coaching, stung more than I wanted to admit. But I pushed past it. Check his phone, I said. Look at his messages when he's not around, or ask him to introduce you to his family, his friends from before he met you. Ask him for references from previous business partners. See what excuses he makes. I'm done with this conversation, Susan said. Don't call me again. The line went dead. I sat staring at my phone, feeling utterly helpless. Susan had already given him $60,000, according to the investigator's report. She'd taken out a home equity loan, which meant she'd put her house at risk. And Brian had inoculated her so thoroughly against the truth that even direct evidence might not penetrate the walls he'd built around her perception. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. We need to talk. Brian wants to discuss next steps for the trust. Can we meet tomorrow? Then Brian made his most dangerous move yet. I spent 2 sleepless nights after Susan hung up on me trying to figure out the right approach. If I went to Ashley with the investigator's report, Brian would spin it as me being vindictive, trying to sabotage her relationship. If I went to my parents first, they'd tell Ashley, and the result would be the same. Every scenario I played out ended with Ashley refusing to believe the evidence, and Brian having time to either disappear or escalate his plans. I was sitting at my kitchen table Wednesday morning, staring at the investigator's report for the 100th time and trying to find a strategy I hadn't considered when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a courier holding an envelope and a clipboard. My stomach tightened with instinctive dread before I even opened the door. Monique Henderson, he asked. Yes? Sign here, please. I signed and took the envelope, noting the return address of a law firm I didn't recognise. My hands had already started shaking before I tore it open. The words, "Petition to remove trustee," appeared at the top of the first page, and my vision tunnelled. Ashley Henderson petitioner versus Monique Henderson respondent. The petition was 17 pages long, dense with legal language, but certain phrases leapt out with brutal clarity. Breach of fiduciary duty, conflict of interest, unauthorised investments, failure to provide adequate reporting, potential misappropriation of trust assets. The requested relief was my immediate removal as trustee, a full forensic audit of all trust transactions, and potential criminal referral if evidence of theft was found. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the papers. I flipped to the final page, and there it was, Ashley's signature dated yesterday, along with notarization. My sister had signed legal papers accusing me of stealing from her. Not in the heat of an argument, not in a moment of anger, but calmly, deliberately, with a lawyer and a notary present. The attached documents included a sworn affidavit from Ashley, claiming I'd hidden the trust arrangement for years to maintain control, refused to provide transparency about investments, and had recently revealed significant personal wealth that suggested I might have been using trust funds for my own benefit. Every fact had been twisted into something sinister. My privacy about the trust became secrecy with malicious intent. My refusal to give detailed investment breakdowns without proper documentation requests became suspicious stonewalling. My financial success became circumstantial evidence of theft. I could see Brian's fingerprints all over this. The legal strategy was too sophisticated for Ashley to have developed alone. The narrative was too perfectly crafted to trigger an investigation, while remaining just plausible enough that a judge would have to take it seriously. And the timing coming just days after I'd revealed my financial situation and started investigating him was no coincidence. This was his counterattack, his way of neutralizing me before I could expose him. If I lost this petition, I'd be removed as trustee and replaced with someone Brian could manipulate or control. The trust would be vulnerable. But worse than that, the petition requested a criminal investigation. Even unfounded allegations of trustee theft would destroy my reputation, trigger audits of all my personal finances, potentially impact my rental properties and investment accounts. Fighting this would cost tens of thousands in legal fees, even if I won. And there was always the risk that some detail, some minor procedural error I'd made in 5 years of managing the trust would be found and used against me. Brian had found the perfect weapon. He'd convinced my sister to accuse me of the very crime he was actively committing financial fraud against the people who trusted him. The audacity of it would have been impressive if it wasn't so destructive. I read through the petition again, my initial shock hardening into something colder and more focused. The claims were baseless, but that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Ashley alleged I'd refused to show her trust. Statements true, because she'd never formally requested them through proper channels until last week. I'd made investments without her approval technically accurate, because the trustee has discretionary authority, and the trust document specifically gave me that power. I'd lived below my apparent means while managing millions suspicious looking, if you wanted it to look suspicious, but actually just evidence of financial prudence. Every allegation walked the line between accurate but misleading and outright false. A judge who didn't look closely might find enough smoke to warrant investigation, and investigation itself would be punishment enough. Frozen assets, legal bills, my name in court records associated with trust theft allegations. The covering letter from the law firm requested my response within 30 days and notified me of a hearing date 6 weeks out. 6 weeks of this hanging over me. 6 weeks of Brian having time to extract more money from Ashley and Susan and whoever else. 6 weeks of my family believing I might actually be a thief. I thought about calling Ashley, but what would I say? She'd signed papers accusing me of stealing from her. She'd chosen to believe Brian's version of reality over 3 decades of sisterhood. Any conversation we had now would be filtered through lawyers and legal strategy. Instead, I called the estate attorney who'd originally set up the trust, Michael Chen, no relation to the investigator, just unfortunate coincidence. His assistant put me through immediately when I said it was urgent regarding the Henderson Trust. "Monique, I just heard," he said, his voice grim. "I got a courtesy call from the petitioner's attorney this morning. I'm so sorry this is happening." "Can they win?" I asked bluntly. "Not on the merits," he said. "You've been a model trustee. Every investment was appropriate, every decision documented, every penny accounted for. I've reviewed the trust annually, and there's not a single legitimate issue. But that doesn't mean the petition isn't dangerous. The court will likely order an independent investigation just to be thorough, and that process alone will be expensive and time-consuming." "That's what he's counting on," I said quietly. "He. Ashley's boyfriend. This is his strategy." I filled Michael in on the investigator's report on Brian's history on the pattern I was seeing. He listened in silence until I finished. "You need to make this information available to the court," he said finally. "File a response that includes the background check. If the petitioner is being manipulated by someone with a criminal history of financial fraud that's absolutely relevant to the proceeding. And if Ashley doesn't believe it, if she thinks I'm making it up to discredit Brian, then we prove it in court where evidence actually matters," Michael said. "But, Monique, there's something else you need to know." But my lawyer called with something that changed everything. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions with me," Michael continued, his voice taking on a different quality, softer, more personal. "He said that if you ever faced a legal challenge regarding Ashley's trust, or if you came to me expressing genuine doubt about whether you should continue as trustee, I was to give you something. I think this lawsuit qualifies." "I don't understand," I said, my mind still spinning from the petition accusations. "The second envelope," Michael said. "The one he left 5 years ago when we set up the trusts. He was very clear about when you should open it. He said you'd know the time was right when you felt like you were choosing between protecting yourself and protecting your family. He said that's when you'd need to hear what he had to say. I felt my throat tighten. I thought that was just a letter with advice about managing Ashley's trust. No, Michael said quietly. This is something else entirely. Something he wanted you to have when you most needed it. Can you come to my office? This isn't the kind of thing I can send by email. An hour later, I sat across from Michael in his downtown office, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. He placed the familiar thick envelope on the desk between us, the one I'd seen 5 years ago and never asked about again. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, and underneath, open when you must choose between duty and self-preservation. He knew, I whispered. He knew something like this would happen. Your grandfather understood people, Michael said, especially the people he loved. Take your time with this. I picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and broke the seal. Inside were legal documents and a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter first and Grandpa's words swam before my eyes. My dearest Monique, if you're reading this, you've reached a breaking point. Someone in the family, probably Ashley, possibly your parents, has pushed you to a place where continuing to protect them means sacrificing yourself. I'm sorry I'm not there to tell you in person what I need you to hear. You are enough exactly as you are without giving anything to anyone. I've watched you your whole life make yourself smaller so others could feel bigger. I've watched you carry burdens that weren't yours and accept crumbs of affection while calling it love. I've watched you become so strong that everyone forgot you might also need to be held up sometimes. I made you trustee of Ashley's inheritance because you're the only one with the judgment and integrity to manage it properly. But I also did it hoping you'd eventually realise that you deserve protection too, not just the responsibility of protecting others. So here's what I've done, sweetheart. I've created a second trust, $3 million invested conservatively, that will be yours under specific conditions. My vision blurred with tears as I read on. The conditions were detailed in the attached legal documents. I had to maintain financial boundaries with my family, limiting any support to less than 20% of my annual income for a minimum of 12 consecutive months. I had to complete at least 10 therapy sessions, specifically focused on family dynamics and boundary setting. Both conditions had to be met before I could access a single dollar. This isn't a punishment, the letter continued. It's a gift I'm forcing you to give yourself because I know you'd never do it on your own. The money itself doesn't matter, you've always been brilliant at building your own wealth. What matters is learning that you're allowed to put yourself first. That saying no to family doesn't make you selfish. That accepting less than you deserve isn't noble. It's self-destruction. Ashley will get her inheritance when she learns responsibility. You'll get yours when you learn that you were never responsible for everyone else's happiness. When you understand that being the strong one doesn't mean carrying everyone else's weight until your back breaks. I love both my granddaughters. But you, Monique, are the one I worry about. Not because you're not capable. You're the most capable person I know. I worry because you've never learned that capability isn't the same as obligation. So here's my last gift to you, permission to save yourself first. Permission to let others fall if falling is what they need to learn. Permission to be loved for who you are, not for what you can carry. The money will be there when you're ready. But more importantly, I hope you'll be there for yourself when you're ready. All my love, Grandpa. I couldn't see the page anymore through my tears. They came in great, heaving sobs that I'd been holding back for years, maybe decades. Michael quietly pushed a box of tissues across his desk and gave me privacy, stepping out of his office and closing the door softly behind him. Grandpa had known. He'd seen exactly who I was and what I was doing to myself, and he'd tried to save me from it even after he was gone. He'd created conditions that would force me to learn what I'd never been able to learn on my own, that my worth wasn't measured by how much I could endure, or how many people I could support, or how little I needed for myself. $3 million, I could only access by learning to set boundaries, by refusing to bankroll my family's endless needs, by going to therapy and admitting that I'd been hurting for years while pretending I was fine. He'd made my healing the condition, not my service. I read through the legal documents with shaking hands. The trust had been funded 5 years ago and had grown through careful investments to nearly 3.4 million. It sat there waiting, untouchable, until I met conditions I'd never even considered trying to meet. I'd spent 5 years focusing on Ashley's requirements while ignoring that I had my own path to walk. The therapy condition felt impossible. I'd have to admit to a stranger that I'd let myself be diminished and overlooked for 3 decades. I'd have to say out loud all the ways I'd learned to make myself small. I'd have to acknowledge that my family's treatment of me wasn't just unfortunate, it was damaging, and I'd participated in my own damage by accepting it. The financial boundary felt equally terrifying. No bailing out Ashley. No covering my parents' unexpected expenses. No being the person everyone called when they needed something. Learning to say no, even when saying yes, would be so much easier than enduring their disappointment. But Grandpa had believed I could do it. More than that, he'd believed I needed to do it. And sitting in that office with his letter in my lap and a lawsuit accusing me of theft on Michael's desk, I finally understood why. That night, Ashley found something on Brian's laptop. My phone rang at 11:30 that night, just as I was finally drifting towards sleep, after hours of staring at the ceiling and replaying Grandpa's letter in my mind. Ashley's name appeared on the screen, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. She'd served me with a lawsuit that morning after all. But something about the late hour made me answer. Monique. Her voice was barely above a whisper, shaking so badly I could hear it through the phone. I need to talk to you. Please don't hang up. I sat up instantly alert. What's wrong? I found something. On Brian's laptop. He went to a work dinner and I was bored and his computer was open and I shouldn't have looked. But I did, and... Her words tumbled over each other in a panicked rush. Slow down, I said, my heart rate accelerating. What did you find? Emails, she said, and I heard her crying now, trying to keep quiet. So many emails with women I don't know, women he's been talking to them the same way he talks to me, calling them baby, making plans, telling them he loves them. I closed my eyes, knowing what was coming, but letting her get there herself. There's this woman, Jennifer, Ashley continued, her voice breaking. He's been seeing her in Seattle. He told her he's a tech consultant and he stays there every other week for work, but he tells me he's traveling for his job. And there's someone named Patricia in San Diego. And she sucked in a breath. And there's detailed emails about Susan, Mum's friend, Susan. He calls her an ongoing project and talks about how much equity she has in her house. Ashley, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, already pulling on jeans with one hand. Where are you right now? In the bedroom. Brian's laptop is still open. He's at dinner, but he could come back any time and I don't know what to do. Monique, there's a spreadsheet. It's called project management, but it's not about work. It's about us, about money. What does it say? I asked, though I could already guess. It has my name with potential 25M next to it and notes about the trust and when he thinks you might release it. It has Susan listed as definite 80k borrowed, 220k home equity available. He's tracked everything, how much money he's gotten from her so far, how much more he thinks he can get when her house might go into foreclosure if she can't pay the loan. Ashley's voice rose into near hysteria. He's treating us like business deals, like investments. There are strategies for each person and timelines and projected returns and... I know, I said quietly. I've known for days. I hired a private investigator. Brian isn't who he says he is. His real history includes multiple fraud convictions. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and devastated. You knew. You tried to tell me and I wouldn't listen. I accused you of being jealous, and I signed those legal papers, and a sob cut off her words. Oh God, Monique, what have I done? Where exactly is Brian right now? I asked, forcing myself to stay focused on the immediate problem. Some investor dinner downtown. He said he'd be out until midnight at least. He's trying to network for his supposed private equity deals, but those probably don't exist either, do they? No, I confirmed. They don't, Ashley. I need you now to take photos of everything on that laptop. The emails, the spreadsheet, anything that shows what he's been doing. Can you do that? I heard movement then, the sound of her phone camera clicking rapidly. I'm taking pictures now. There's so much. Emails going back months before we even met, making plans about how to approach me. He researched our family, Monique. He knew about you managing the trust before we started dating. This was all calculated. The clicking continued as she photographed evidence. I was already grabbing my keys, heading for my car. Keep sending those photos to my phone. I'm coming to get you. No, wait. Ashley's voice pitched higher with panic. If he comes back and I'm gone, if he knows I found this stuff, he's going to know you found it the moment he opens that laptop and sees someone's been through his files. I said, we need to get you somewhere safe and then figure out our next move. I sent him the lawsuit papers, Ashley said, her voice thick with shame. He found a lawyer, he wrote most of it himself, and then told me what to say in my affidavit. He said you were stealing from me, and I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, because if he was right, then everything made sense. But you weren't stealing. You were protecting me. From him. We'll deal with the lawsuit later, I said, even though hearing her admit Brian had orchestrated it made something loosen in my chest. Right now, I need you to... Wait, Ashley interrupted. There's something else. A folder labelled insurance. I'm opening it. I heard her sharp intake of breath. What is it? I demanded. Voice recordings, she said faintly. Dozens of them. He's been recording our conversations. Private conversations about the trust, about our family, about you. And there are videos too from his phone of me crying and upset. And the dates on these are from when we'd fight and then he'd comfort me, and I thought he was being supportive, but he was recording me being emotional and unstable looking. The calculated cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Brian had been building a case, creating evidence he could use to paint Ashley as irrational or manipulable content he could weaponize if she ever tried to expose him or if he needed leverage. He'd been documenting everything, not out of love, but out of strategy. Get out of there right now, I said, no longer asking. I don't care if he comes back and knows you found it. Take your phone, take your purse and get outside. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Okay, Ashley whispered. Okay, I'm going. I'm leaving the laptop open. I want him to know that I know. I want him to... Her voice cut off abruptly. I heard a door opening in the background. Ashley, I said urgently. Ashley, what's happening? When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. He's home early. He just walked in. But Brian came home early and found Ashley at his laptop. Ashley. I heard Brian's voice through the phone, distant but clear. What are you doing on my laptop? I stayed on the line, my phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt. I'd already started my car and was backing out of my driveway, but I was at least 10 minutes away from Ashley's apartment. 10 minutes where anything could happen. I was just checking email, Ashley said, and I could hear the tremor in her voice, despite her attempt to sound casual. My phone died. On my computer. Brian's tone was still friendly, but there was an edge underneath it now. You know I keep work files on here, baby. Confidential client information. You should have asked first. I heard movement footsteps, then Brian's voice again closer to the phone now. Were you looking at something specific? No, Ashley's voice cracked. Who's Jennifer? The silence that followed was thick with tension. I was flying down residential streets faster than I should have, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Jennifer is a business associate, Brian said finally, his voice smooth, again, slipping back into that practiced reassurance he wielded like a weapon. I've told you about her. She's helping with the Seattle expansion plans. You told her you loved her, Ashley said, and I heard the tears in her voice. In an email from last week, you said you couldn't wait to build a life with her. Ashley, sweetheart, you're taking things out of context. Business relationships in high-level finance involve a certain amount of personal rapport. It doesn't mean anything. You're the one I'm with. You're the one I chose. What about the spreadsheet? Ashley's voice was stronger now, anger cutting through fear. The one that lists me and Susan and those other women with dollar amounts next to our names. What context explains that? Another pause. I could hear Brian thinking, recalibrating his approach. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more serious, more intimate. Okay, he said. You want the truth? Fine. I've been planning our future, Ashley, making strategic decisions about how to optimize resources when your trust comes through. Susan offered to invest in some opportunities I had access to, so yes, I've been tracking that. The other women are business partners or potential investors. I keep detailed records because that's what successful people do. They plan. You called us projects, Ashley said. You have projected returns listed for how much money you expect to get from each of us. That's not what that means, Brian said, and his voice took on a hint of exasperation now, as if she was being deliberately difficult. You're looking at business planning documents with no context and jumping to the worst possible conclusions. This is exactly why I keep my work separate. It looks bad to people who don't understand high-level financial strategy. I saw the emails about Susan's house, Ashley said, and I heard steel in her voice I'd never heard before. You're planning for her to lose it when she can't pay the equity loan. You wrote that you'd be positioned to buy it at foreclosure prices. That's not business strategy, that's predatory. Susan made her own investment choices, Brian said, his voice hardening now that gentle manipulation wasn't working. I gave her opportunities. If she can't manage her finances, that's not my responsibility. And honestly, Ashley, going through my private files and making accusations based on things you don't understand, that's a massive breach of trust between us. The audacity of him accusing her of breaching trust while he'd been systematically defrauding her and her family would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. I want you to leave, Ashley said quietly. Baby, no, listen to me. Brian's voice turned pleading, vulnerable in a way I knew was calculated. You're upset, you're confused. I know finding those files looks bad, but if you throw away what we have over a misunderstanding, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. We're good together. We're building something amazing. Don't let your sister poison what we have. This isn't about Monique, Ashley said. Isn't it? Brian's tone sharpened. She's been trying to turn you against me since the day we met. She's jealous of what we have. Jealous that you found someone who sees your potential. If you tell your family about this, they'll side with her. You'll lose me. And without me, what do you have? 47,000 in debt. A family that's always seen you as the screw-up. No real career. No prospects, just waiting for an inheritance you might never get because your sister controls it. The cruelty in his words made me want to scream. He was weaponizing every insecurity Ashley had ever had, every wound the family had inflicted over the years, turning them into reasons she should stay with him. If you walk away from me, Brian continued, his voice dropping into something almost hypnotic, you're walking away from the only person who's ever believed in you, the only person who's ever made you feel special and important and worthy. Your family tolerates you. I love you. Can you really not see the difference? I could hear Ashley crying now, and my heart broke for her. She'd spent 32 years being told she wasn't enough, that she needed help, that she couldn't manage on her own. And Brian had built his entire strategy on exploiting those exact wounds. "I need time to think," Ashley said finally, her voice barely audible. "Of course," Brian said, and his tone went gentle again, supportive. "Take all the time you need, baby. I'll stay at a hotel tonight. Give you space to process everything. But Ashley and I need you to really hear this. If you tell your family, if you let Monique turn this into some kind of witch hunt against me, there's no coming back from that. I won't be able to stay with someone who doesn't trust me, who believes her jealous sister over me. So you have a choice to make. Me and the future we've been planning together, or them and everything that comes with that." "I understand," Ashley whispered. "I'll call you tomorrow," Brian said. "We'll talk this through when you're calmer. I love you." I heard the door close. Several seconds of silence, then Ashley's voice stronger now, speaking directly into the phone she'd never disconnected. "Monique, are you still there?" "I'm 5 minutes away," I said. "Pack a bag, you're staying with me tonight." "He gave me 24 hours, Ashley said, and she sounded lost young in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "To choose. Him or the family. But Monique, what if he's right? What if I'm nothing without him?" "Pack your bag," I repeated firmly. "We'll talk when I get there." "But Ashley, you're not nothing. You never were. That's just what he needed you to believe." At 2 a.m, Ashley appeared at my door. I opened the door before Ashley could knock, and the sight of her nearly broke me. She stood on my porch with a hastily packed duffel bag, mascara streaked down her face, wearing mismatched clothes she'd clearly grabbed without thinking. Her hands were shaking so badly, the bag slipped from her grip and landed on the doormat with a soft thud. "I don't know what's real anymore," she said, her voice cracking on every word. "Everything I thought I knew about him, about us, about myself. I don't know if any of it was true. How could I be so stupid? How could I not see it?" I didn't answer with words. I just stepped forward and pulled her into my arms, and she collapsed against me, sobbing with the kind of raw anguish that comes from having your entire reality shattered. She cried like she'd never cried in front of me before, not the dramatic tears she used to get her way, or the performance tears meant to elicit sympathy, but genuine, ugly, broken sobs that shook her whole body. I held her on my porch in the middle of the night, one hand cradling her head against my shoulder, the way I'd done when we were children, and she'd had nightmares. I didn't tell her it would be okay, or that she'd get through this, or any of the empty platitudes that meant nothing in moments like these. I just held her and let her break apart in a safe place. Eventually, I guided her inside, and she let me lead her to the couch like a child still crying, but quieter now, the kind of crying that was mostly exhaustion and shock. I brought her tissues and water and sat beside her, and we stayed like that for a long time without speaking. "I can't trust my own judgment," Ashley said, finally staring at her hands. "I thought he loved me. I thought I was special to him. But it was all calculated. Every word, every gesture, every moment I thought was genuine, he was playing a role, and I bought every single second of it." "That doesn't mean you're stupid," I said gently. "It means he's good at what he does. He's had years of practice fooling people. You're not the first, and you wouldn't have been the last." "But I should have listened to you," Ashley said, fresh tears spilling over. "You tried to warn me, and I called you jealous. I signed legal papers accusing you of stealing from me because he told me to. I chose him over you, over and over again, and you were right about everything." "You're here now," I said. "That's what matters." She looked at me, then really looked at me for maybe the first time in years. "Why? After everything I've done, why do you still care? I've been terrible to you our whole lives. I let Mum and Dad treat you like you didn't matter. I took and never gave anything back. And even now, even after I tried to destroy you with that lawsuit, you came to get me." I thought about Grandpa's letter about $3 million I couldn't access until I learned to set boundaries. About decades of making myself small and swallowing hurts and choosing peace over honesty. about how easy it would be to say something cutting now to let Ashley feel the weight of everything she'd done to make her understand how much it had cost me. But that wasn't who I wanted to be anymore. "Do you remember 4th grade?" I asked instead. "When you were 9 and those girls in your class started picking on you?" Ashley blinked, confused by the subject change. "Sarah Martinez and her friends. They said I was annoying." "They said worse than that," I reminded her gently. "They said you were stupid and ugly and nobody wanted to be your friend. They made you eat lunch alone every day for 2 weeks until you finally told Mum, and Mum told me, and I was so angry I couldn't see straight." "You sat with me," Ashley said softly, the memory clearly coming back. "Every lunch period for the rest of the year. You were in 6th grade. You should have been sitting with your own friends." "My friends understood," I said, "because I told them my little sister needed me, and that mattered more than anything else. Do you remember what I told you the first day I sat down at your table?" Ashley's eyes filled with tears again. "You said, sisters take care of each other. Always." "I meant it then, and I mean it now," I said. "I didn't need $25 million to love you, Ashley. I didn't need you to be successful or financially responsible or anything other than who you were. I loved you when you had nothing but scraped knees and bad dreams and a smile that could light up a room when you weren't being tortured by mean 4th graders." "But I've been terrible to you," Ashley whispered. "You've been hurt and lost and manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit every insecurity our family ever gave you," I said. "And yes, you've made choices that hurt me. But you're also sitting here at 2 a.m, having just walked away from someone who had you completely under his control because some part of you was strong enough to see the truth and brave enough to leave. That matters." Ashley was quiet for a long time, her fingers twisting the tissue in her hands into shreds. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of everything. Of Brian coming after me. Of Mum and Dad finding out how stupid I've been. Of having to face what I've done to you, to Susan, to everyone. Of being alone and having to figure out who I even am without someone telling me." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "But most of all, I'm scared that he's right. That I really am nothing without him. That I can't survive on my own." "You survived for 32 years before you met him," I pointed out. "And you'll survive long after he's gone. You're stronger than you think, Ashley. You just never had to find out how strong because everyone kept catching you before you could catch yourself." "Will you help me?" Ashley asked. "I know I don't deserve it after everything, but will you help me face him? I want to do the right thing. I want to stop him from hurting Susan and those other women, but I can't do it alone. I need you with me." This was it, I realised. The moment Grandpa had been preparing me for. Not just the moment where I had to choose between protecting Ashley and protecting myself, but the moment where I had to learn the difference between carrying someone and standing beside them while they carried themselves. "I'll be with you," I said. "But Ashley, you're going to have to be the one to face him. I'll stand next to you, but I can't fight this battle for you. This has to come from you." "I know," she said, and for the first time that night I saw something other than fear in her eyes. Determination, maybe. Or just the first fragile shoots of the person she could become. "When do we do this?" "When you're ready," I said. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "Tomorrow. I want to do it tomorrow before I lose my nerve. Call Mum and Dad, call Susan. Everyone needs to know the truth." The next morning, we called everyone together, including Susan. By 11 o'clock, everyone had gathered in my parents' living room with the kind of tense energy that comes before a storm breaks. My parents sat together on the sofa, confusion and worry etched into their faces. Michael Chen stood near the window with a briefcase full of documentation. Susan perched on the edge of an armchair, her body language defensive, clearly unhappy about being summoned to what she probably assumed was an ambush about her relationship. Ashley sat beside me, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing what she needed to say, terrified she'd lose her nerve when the moment came. I'd stayed up with her, and now exhaustion pulled at both of us, but we were running on determination and the knowledge that this had to be done today before Brian could regroup or disappear. Brian arrived at exactly at 11:15, fashionably late in a way that suggested he was in control of the situation. He walked in wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his smile confident and concerned in equal measure, playing the role of supportive boyfriend who'd graciously agreed to attend this family drama, despite being unfairly maligned. The smile faltered when he saw Susan. I watched realization flash across his face. Confusion, followed by calculation, followed by something that might have been fear. His eyes darted between Susan and Ashley, and I could practically see him trying to figure out how his two worlds had collided, whether they'd compared notes, how much damage control he needed to do. "Susan," he said, his voice managing to sound surprised and pleased. "I didn't know you'd be here. How are you?" "Mark asked me to come," Susan said, and the ice in her voice suggested that my phone call had planted enough doubt that she'd done some investigating of her own. "Or should I call you Brian, since that's apparently your real name?" Brian's practiced composure slipped another notch. "I can explain that. I use different names for different business contexts. It's common in private equity when—" "Stop," Ashley said, her voice shaking but clear. She stood up, and I stood with her, a silent show of support. "Just stop lying. We know everything." She pulled out her phone and began displaying the photos. She'd taken emails to multiple women, the spreadsheet labeling people with dollar amounts, message discussing how to extract maximum value from each project. My father's face went pale as Ashley scrolled through image after image. My mother's hand moved to her mouth. "You've been running scams on at least 4 women simultaneously," Ashley continued, her voice gaining strength as she went. "You convinced me to transfer $15,000 to a fake company you created. You've been recording our private conversations without my knowledge. And you convinced me to sign legal papers accusing my sister of theft while you were actively stealing from me." "Ashley, sweetheart, you're taking things out of context again," Brian started, but Susan cut him off. "He borrowed $80,000 from me," Susan said, and her voice cracked with anger and shame. "Against my house, for an investment in commercial real estate that he said would double my money in 6 months. That was 4 months ago, and I haven't seen a single statement or return. When I asked about it last week, he said the timeline had extended, but not to worry." "There is no investment," I said, speaking for the first time. "The company he told you to transfer money to doesn't exist beyond a shell LLC registered to his old apartment. The money went directly to him, and it's gone." "You're poison," Brian said, and the mask finally dropped, completely revealing something cold and vicious underneath. "You've been trying to sabotage this relationship from day one because you can't stand seeing your sister happy. This is all manufactured drama designed to—" "We filed a complaint with the FBI Financial Fraud Division yesterday afternoon," Michael Chen said, his voice cutting through Brian's deflection with calm authority. "Your activities cross state lines and involve multiple victims, which makes this a federal case. The investigative report documents a pattern of fraud going back over a decade, including 2 prior convictions under different names." The colour drained from Brian's face. The spreadsheet Ashley found references specific dollar amounts and notional amounts from multiple victims, which corroborates the fraud allegations, Michael continued. "The emails establish intent and planning. The recordings you made without consent violate wiretapping laws in this state. Combined with the prior convictions, you are looking at potential prison time ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on how many additional victims come forward." "This is insane," Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You can't just file complaints based on a jealous sister's manipulated evidence. I have rights." "You do have rights," I agreed. "The right to an attorney, which I suggest you exercise immediately. The FBI will want to interview you within the next few days. Your lawyer will be receiving a subpoena for all financial records within 48 hours. Brian's eyes darted to the door and I saw him calculate whether he could bolt. I moved to stand between him and the exit, and something in my expression must have communicated that I wouldn't be moved easily. "If you run," I said quietly, "the warrant will be issued nationwide. You'll be arrested at whatever airport you try to flee through. But if you stay and cooperate, if you return the money you've stolen and plead guilty, the prosecutor might be willing to negotiate on sentencing." "I haven't stolen anything," Brian said, but it was automatic now, a lie he told without any hope of it being believed. "This is all a misunderstanding. I took out a home equity loan because you said it was a guaranteed investment," Susan said, and tears were streaming down her face now. "I trusted you. I thought you loved me. You called me every day, made me feel special, made me believe I'd found someone who really saw me. And the whole time I was just a bank account to you. Susan, I do care about you." Brian tried taking a step toward her, but she recoiled. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare. I defended you to Monique. I told her she was bitter and jealous because I couldn't imagine that someone could be that calculating, that cruel. I chose you over people who were trying to help me because you made me feel like I mattered. But I didn't matter at all, did I? None of us did." "The meeting is over," I said. "You need to leave." "Ashley," Brian said, turning to her with desperate intensity. "You know me. You know what we have is real. Don't let them do this. Come with me right now and we'll figure this out together." Ashley looked at him for a long moment, and I saw her visibly gather herself, pulling together every ounce of courage she had. "I'm dropping the lawsuit," she said. "My lawyer will file papers withdrawing all accusations against Monique by end of business today. And I'm submitting a sworn statement to the FBI about everything you did, the fake investment, the recordings, the manipulation. I hope it helps put you in prison." Something ugly twisted across Brian's face. "You'll regret this. All of you will regret this." He turned to leave, and as he passed through the door, he looked back one last time. "Good luck managing $25 million when you can barely manage your credit cards, Ashley. Give it 2 years and you'll be broke and alone and wishing you'd stayed with the only person who ever saw potential in you." As Brian stormed out, my mother did something I never expected. My mother stood abruptly from the sofa and crossed the room to me. Before I could process what was happening, she dropped to her knees in front of me, her hands reaching for mine, her face crumbling in a way I'd never seen before. "Mom, what are you—" I started, but she shook her head violently. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, let me say this. I need to say this before I lose my nerve." Everyone in the room went still. My father looked stricken. Ashley had frozen mid-reach for a tissue. Susan stared at my mother with the kind of recognition that comes from seeing your own pain reflected in someone else's face. Michael Chen quietly gathered his papers, preparing to give the family privacy. "I need to tell you why I was so hard on you," my mother said, gripping my hand so tightly it almost hurt. "Because you deserve to know. You've deserved to know for 30 years, and I was too much of a coward to tell you." "Mum, you don't have to do this now," I said gently, uncomfortable with seeing her like this, my always composed mother on her knees, makeup running, hands shaking. "Yes, I do," she insisted, "because I just watched what silence and secrets did to Ashley. I watched a predator nearly destroy her because she didn't know her own worth, because we never taught her to recognize her value beyond what others told her she was. And I did that, not just to her, but to you too, in different ways, but I damaged you both." She took a shuddering breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother was a difficult woman. I know you remember her as sweet as the one who always had cookies and hugs, but that was Grandpa's influence softening her edges in her final years. When I was growing up, she was hard, unforgiving. She'd had a terrible childhood herself, poverty, an alcoholic father, a mother who worked 3 jobs and barely had time to acknowledge her children existed. She survived by becoming tough. impenetrable, and she raised me the same way. My father moved to stand behind my mother, his hand on her shoulder, and she reached up to grip it like a lifeline. Nothing I did was ever quite good enough, my mother continued. If I got an A, she wanted to know why it wasn't an A+. If I cried about something, she told me to stop being weak and learn to handle things on my own. When I was 16 and my first boyfriend broke my heart, she told me I was too soft, that crying over a boy was pathetic, that I needed to be stronger. The world will eat you alive if you can't toughen up, she'd say. And I believed her. I believed that being strong meant never needing anyone, never showing weakness, never asking for help. Tears were streaming down her face now, and I felt my own eyes filling in response. I'd never heard any of this. My grandmother had died when I was 12, and by then she'd been gentle, devoted to Grandpa, always ready with kind words and home-baked treats. I'd had no idea what she'd been like before. When I had you girls, my mother said, looking between Ashley and me, I was so determined to prepare you for the world. I'd been hurt so many times because I wasn't tough enough, wasn't strong enough, couldn't handle things without falling apart. And I thought I really believed that if I made you both stronger than I'd been, you'd be okay, you'd survive. But you treated us differently, I said quietly. Because you were different, my mother said. Ashley was so sensitive, so easily overwhelmed. She reminded me of myself at that age, and I was terrified that if I demanded too much of her, she'd break. So I protected her. Maybe too much. I let her depend on us. I caught her every time she fell because I couldn't bear to watch her suffer the way I'd suffered. She turned to look directly at me, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. But you, Monique, you were so capable from the very beginning, so calm and composed and able to handle whatever life threw at you. And instead of celebrating that, instead of nurturing it, I just took advantage of it. I piled more and more on your shoulders because you could carry it. And I told myself I was making you strong, preparing you for a hard world, teaching you independence. But really, I was just doing to you what my mother did to me. You never meant to hurt me, I said, my voice thick with tears I was trying to hold back. Intent doesn't erase impact, my mother said. I hurt you. For years and years I hurt you. I let you believe that your value came from how much you could endure, how little you needed, how capable you were of handling everything alone. I taught you that asking for help was weakness, that having needs was a burden, that love was something you had to earn by being useful rather than something you deserved simply for existing. She was sobbing now, the words coming out in gasps. I watched you make yourself smaller and smaller. I watched you take on everyone's problems while never sharing your own. I watched you succeed at things, and I barely acknowledged it because you were supposed to be strong. And all the while I was congratulating myself on preparing you for life while I was actually just repeating my mother's mistakes, teaching you the same horrible lesson I'd learned, that you're only valuable if you're not a burden. Mum, I said, my own tears falling freely now. I never knew about Grandma, about any of it. I never told you, she said. I was too ashamed. Your grandfather worked so hard to heal her, to help her see that being soft didn't mean being weak. By the time you girls knew her, she'd changed. She'd done the work to break her own patterns. But by then, the damage to me was already done. And I'd started doing the same damage to you. She saw it, I said, suddenly remembering the argument I'd overheard as a child. Grandma, she saw what you were doing to me. I heard her tell you once that you were too hard on me. My mother nodded. She tried to warn me. She told me I was making the same mistakes she'd made, that I was going to lose you if I didn't change. And I got so angry because I thought I was doing it differently, doing it better. I thought I was teaching you strength, not weakness. I couldn't see that strength and hardness aren't the same thing, that you could be strong and still need people. that you could be capable and still deserve coishul. I thought you just loved Ashley more. I admitted, the words coming out before I could stop them. Oh, sweetheart, my mother said, and fresh sobs racked her body. I loved you both equally and damaged you both differently. Ashley never learned to stand on her own because I protected her too much. You never learned you deserved to be protected because I demanded too much. I broke you in opposite directions while telling myself I was helping. My father spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. I let it happen, he said. I saw what was happening, and I told myself Carol knew best, that she was their mother, and I should trust her instincts. But really, I was just taking the easy path. It was easier to let you be the strong one, Monique, than to insist you be allowed to be weak sometimes too. The room felt heavy with generations of pain finally being spoken aloud. My mother was still on her knees holding my hands, and I realised she was waiting for something, forgiveness maybe, or permission to stand, or just acknowledgement that I'd heard what she was trying to say. I need you to know, my mother said, her voice steadying slightly, that none of your strength came from my hardness. You were strong despite me, not because of me. And you deserved so much better than what I gave you. You deserved to be loved without conditions, to be celebrated without qualifications, to be held when you hurt instead of expected to hold everyone else. I'm so sorry I took away your right to be weak sometimes. I pulled my mother to her feet and into my arms, and we stood there crying together, 30 years of misunderstanding and hurt finally being acknowledged, if not yet fully healed. I thought about Grandpa's letter, about how he'd understood all of this, about how he tried to force both healing through those trust conditions, making Ashley learn responsibility, making me learn boundaries. We stop it here, I said into my mother's hair. The cycle stops with us. No more pretending we're fine when we're not. No more measuring love by how little we need. No more passing down pain and calling it preparation. Then Ashley said something none of us saw coming. Ashley stepped forward, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in days. I need to say something too. We all turned to look at her, and I saw something in her face that hadn't been there before, not just determination, but a kind of clarity that suggested she'd been thinking about this for longer than the past 24 hours. I want to do the challenge, she said, looking directly at me. The 6-month financial responsibility thing Grandpa required for the trust. The credit score, the debt pay down, the financial literacy courses. All of it. Ashley, you don't have to decide that right now. I started, but she shook her head. Yes, I do. Because if I don't decide it now, if I don't commit to it while I'm still seeing clearly what I've become, I'll slip back into old patterns. I'll start making excuses. I'll convince myself I'm fine the way I am. She took a shaky breath. But I'm not fine. Brian saw that before any of us did. He knew exactly what buttons to push because I've spent 32 years letting other people define my worth. First, it was Mum and Dad telling me I was too sensitive, too weak, couldn't handle things. Then it was boyfriends telling me I needed them to be complete. Then it was Brian telling me I was nothing without him. You're not nothing, my father said quietly. I know that intellectually, Ashley said, but I don't feel it. I don't know it in the way that matters, and I need to learn, not just for the trust, but for myself. She turned back to me. But I want to add something to Grandpa's conditions. I don't want any family money during those 6 months. No bailouts, no loans, no help with my rent or my car payment or anything. I need to know I can actually support myself, that I can survive without someone catching me. My mother made a small sound of protest, but Ashley held up a hand. I need this, Mum. Every time you've given me money, you've reinforced the message that I can't handle things on my own. And I've used that as an excuse not to try. But I'm done with that. I'm done being the sister who needs rescuing. What will you do for income my father asked, and it was a practical question, but also tinged with the doubt I knew Ashley had been hearing her whole life. I enrolled in an online graphic design program, Ashley said, and a flush of embarrassment coloured her cheeks. Last night, while I couldn't sleep. It's something I've wanted to do since high school, but Mum said it wasn't practical, that I needed a stable career path, that creative fields were too risky. So I majored in business instead and hated every minute of it and never used the degree anyway. I remembered Ashley in high school always doodling in the margins of her notebooks, creating elaborate designs for imaginary brands and products. She'd been genuinely talented, but somewhere along the way, she'd been convinced that talent didn't matter if it couldn't guarantee financial security. The program is 12 weeks intensive. Ashley continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. I can take freelance design jobs before I even finish. There are platforms where businesses hire designers for small projects, logos, social media graphics, website designs. The money isn't great at first, but it's something. And it's mine. Something I built with my own skills instead of waiting for someone to give it to me or depending on an inheritance. Ashley, that's wonderful, Susan said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation with Brian. I had no idea you were interested in design. Nobody did, Ashley said quietly, because I learned to hide the things I wanted in favour of doing what other people thought I should do. But I'm tired of living someone else's version of my life. She looked at each of us in turn, and I saw her gathering her courage for what came next. If I make it through the 6 months, if I prove I can support myself and manage my money and get my debt under control, I still want the trust. But I don't want to use it the way I used to think I would. I don't want a big house or fancy cars or whatever else I thought would make me feel valuable. What do you want to use it for? I asked. I want to help other women like Susan and me, Ashley said. Women who end up in relationships with men like Brian because they don't know their own worth. Women who've been taught they need someone else to be complete. I want to create some kind of organisation. I don't know exactly what yet that helps women recognise financial abuse and get out of dangerous relationships. Maybe it's a shelter, maybe it's education programs, maybe it's legal aid, but I want to take something that nearly destroyed me and use it to protect other people. The room had gone completely silent. My mother was staring at Ashley with an expression I couldn't quite read, shock maybe, or pride, or grief, for all the years Ashley had been capable of this kind of thinking, but had never been encouraged to pursue it. Grandpa would love that, I said softly. I think that's why he set up the conditions, Ashley said, not to punish me, but because he knew I needed to learn what I was capable of before I could be trusted with that much money. If he'd just given it to me, I would have blown through it trying to fill holes that money can't fill. But if I earn it by becoming someone who doesn't need it to feel whole, then maybe I can use it for something that actually matters. Do you know how hard the next 6 months are going to be? I asked, not trying to discourage her, but needing her to understand what she was committing to. Probably harder than anything I've ever done, Ashley admitted. I'm going to have to live on almost nothing while I build up design clients. I'm going to have to watch every penny while paying down debt. I'm going to have to sit with being uncomfortable instead of running to someone to fix it. And I'm going to have to do it all while knowing that there is $25 million sitting in a trust that I can't touch. She smiled, but it was shaky. Honestly, I'm terrified, but I'm more terrified of staying who I've been. My father stood and crossed to Ashley, pulling her into a hug that made her start crying again. I'm proud of you, he said simply. I should have said that more often. I'm proud of you. We'll all support you, my mother said, just not financially. Is that the right way to say it? Ashley laughed through her tears. Yeah, Mum, that's exactly right. I thought about Grandpa sitting in his study 5 years ago, crafting trust conditions for 2 granddaughters who needed such different things. He'd known Ashley would need to hit bottom before she could rebuild. He'd known I would need permission to let her, and somehow he'd structured everything so that we'd both have the chance to become who we were meant to be, rather than who the family had convinced us we were. I'll send you the financial literacy course recommendations tomorrow, I said, and the names of credit repair specialists, and we'll set up monthly check-ins so I can track your progress for the trust requirements. Thank you, Ashley said, for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. Sisters take care of each other, I said, echoing words I'd spoken to her 2 decades ago. Always. 5 months later, everything had changed. I sat in Ashley's tiny studio apartment, the one she'd moved into, after leaving the place she'd shared with Brian, and watched her work on a logo design for a local non-profit. Her desk was set up near the window to catch natural light, her laptop surrounded by sketch pads and colour swatches and half-empty coffee cups. The apartment was small, and definitely not what Ashley had once imagined for herself, but it was hers, paid for with money she'd earned. "What do you think?" she asked, turning the screen toward me. "Too busy." The design was clean and elegant, a stylized phoenix rising, with second chances curved beneath it, in font she'd created herself. "It's perfect," I said honestly. "Susan is going to love it." Ashley grinned, and it was a different smile than the ones I'd seen on her for years, genuine, earned, not dependent on someone else's approval. She's been so great about letting me experiment. Half the small businesses in town have my designs now, because she keeps recommending me to everyone who comes into the cafe. The cafe. Susan's Second Chances Bakery and Cafe had opened 2 months ago, funded, partially by the money the FBI had recovered from Brian's accounts, and partially by a small business loan Susan had qualified for after her credit had stabilized. The concept was simple but powerful, a neighborhood cafe that specifically hired women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse or domestic violence. Ashley had designed everything, the logo, the menus, the interior signage, even the website. "How's the income looking this month?" I asked, pulling out my phone, where I kept notes on Ashley's progress toward the trust conditions. $3,500, Ashley said, pride evident in her voice. 3 regular monthly retainer clients, plus 4 one-off projects. And I'm pitching a bigger project next week, a full brand identity package for a startup. If I get it, that's another $2,000. I made notes calculating in my head. Ashley had started the challenge with $47,000 in debt. 5 months later, she'd paid off $30,000 of it through a combination of aggressive budgeting debt consolidation at a better interest rate and applying every spare dollar to the balances. Her credit score had climbed from 573 to 648, still below the required 650, but close enough that 1 more month would likely get her there. "The financial literacy course?" I prompted. "Finished module 8 of 10 last week," Ashley said. "Final exam is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. I should complete it with 2 weeks to spare before the 6-month deadline." I set down my phone and looked at my sister, really looked at her. She'd lost weight, not from stress, but from walking everywhere to save on gas money and cooking at home instead of ordering delivery. Her clothes were simpler, mostly thrifted or from discount stores, but she wore them with a confidence she'd never had when everything was designer labels. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail rather than the high-maintenance style she used to maintain. She looked healthier than I'd ever seen her. "You're going to make it," I said. "All the conditions. You're actually going to meet every single one of Grandpa's requirements." "I know," Ashley said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she was still surprised by her own capability. "I didn't think I could. That first month was hell, Monique. I wanted to quit every single day. I'd lie awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how to make $70 stretch to cover groceries and gas until the next client payment cleared. I wanted to call Mum and ask for just a little help so many times." "But you didn't," I said. "But I didn't," she confirmed. And somewhere around month 2, something shifted. I stopped focusing on what I didn't have and started seeing what I could create. Every logo I designed, every client who said they loved my work, every dollar I earned, it was proof that I could do this, that I didn't need someone to save me because I could save myself. My phone buzzed with a news alert and I glanced down to see a notification about Brian's sentencing. The trial had been swift. His guilty plea on multiple counts of fraud had eliminated the need for lengthy proceedings. I pulled up the article and scanned it quickly. Brian was sentenced this morning, I said. 5 years federal prison, plus $340,000 in restitution to victims. Ashley's face went still. How many victims? 11 came forward, I said, including you and Susan. The others were from previous states, previous identities. Some of the cases were too old to prosecute separately, but they factored into sentencing. Good, Ashley said quietly. I hope every single day of those 5 years is miserable for him. Is that terrible of me? It's human of you, I said. He tried to destroy you. You're allowed to be glad he's facing consequences. Susan had been one of the victims who testified, sharing her story of how she'd lost $80,000 and nearly lost her home. The judge had been particularly moved by her testimony, according to Michael Chen, who'd attended the sentencing. The restitution wouldn't make everyone whole. Brian had already spent most of the money he'd stolen, but it was something. A week later, we gathered at my parents' house to mark Ashley's completion of the 6-month challenge. The atmosphere was celebratory, but also nervous. Ashley had asked everyone to come, but hadn't told us why, just that she had something important to discuss about the trust. You did it, my father said as soon as Ashley walked in, pulling her into a hug. 6 months of meeting every condition. Your grandfather would be so proud. I need to tell you all something, Ashley said once we'd settled in the living room. She looked at me specifically. I've thought a lot about what happens now. I've met all of Grandpa's conditions. The trust can be released. We can start the transfer process next week, I confirmed. The lawyers just need you to sign some paperwork and... I want to wait, Ashley interrupted. Another year, maybe longer. The room went silent. I don't understand, my mother said. Why would you wait when you've worked so hard to meet the requirements? Because I finally understand what Grandpa was trying to teach me, Ashley said. The money was never the point. Learning who I am without the money was the point, and I'm just starting to figure that out. If I take the trust now, I'm afraid I'll slip back into old patterns. I'll start spending to fill emotional holes instead of addressing what's actually empty. But if I keep going, keep building my business, keep proving to myself that I'm okay without it, then when I do access it, I'll use it the way Grandpa intended, to help others, not to fix myself. And that Christmas, we gathered somewhere unexpected. Second chances. Bakery and cafe had been transformed for the holiday. String lights wound through the exposed ceiling beams. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments made by the staff, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh-baked bread filled the warm space. Ashley had closed the cafe to the public for the evening, so our family could celebrate here, but several of the women who worked there had stayed this place, had become their family too. I watched Ashley move through the space with quiet confidence, checking on dishes in the kitchen, laughing with Susan over some private joke. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair in a messy bun, flour dusting her forearms from helping with the baking earlier. She looked nothing like the polished, anxious woman who'd brought Brian to meet the family that Thanksgiving over a year ago. She looked real, present, herself. I can't believe how much this place has grown, my mother said, coming to stand beside me. She'd been volunteering at the cafe twice a week, teaching basic budgeting classes to the women Susan and Ashley hired. It was her way of breaking her own cycles. Ashley's hired 4 more women in the past 2 months, I said, and she's talking about expanding to a second location. We gathered around the long farmhouse table Ashley had found at an estate sale and refinished herself. My parents, Ashley, Susan, 2 of the cafe employees, who'd become friends, and me. It felt right in a way our formal Thanksgiving dinners never had genuine earned built on actual connection rather than obligation. After dinner, Ashley stood and cleared her throat nervously. I have something for Monique, I unwrapped the package and found myself staring at a framed illustration, beautiful, detailed clearly Ashley's work. It showed 4 women spanning generations, their silhouettes overlapping and intertwining. I recognized my grandmother's profile, then my mother's, then my own, and Ashley's. Above them, the words breaking cycles, building love were rendered in Ashley's distinctive hand lettering. I wanted to honour what we've all done this year, Ashley said softly. Grandma started the cycle by surviving the only way she knew how. Mum continued it because that's what she'd been taught. But you and I were ending it. We're choosing something different. I couldn't speak past the tightness in my throat, so I just pulled my sister into a fierce hug. I have something to share too, I said once I'd composed myself. Michael Chen called me last week. I've met the conditions for Grandpa's second trust. I've kept financial support to family under 20% of my income for 14 months, and I completed 10 therapy sessions last month. The trust is unlocked. $3.4 million. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Monique, that's wonderful. I know what I want to do with it, I continued. Ashley's vision for second chances is helping women escape financial abuse and rebuild their lives. It's exactly what Grandpa would have wanted. I want to fund an expansion, multiple locations across different cities, a whole network of safe places where women can work, learn financial literacy, and discover their own strength. Are you serious? Ashley breathed. Completely, I said. You've built something incredible here. When you're ready to access your trust, we can use that to expand even further. But we start with mine. My father stood and raised his glass. To second chances, and to daughters who are braver than their parents ever were. We toasted, and I looked around the table at these people I'd once believed I had to carry alone. My mother learning to support without smothering. My father finding his voice after years of silence. Susan rebuilding a life after devastation. And Ashley finally understanding that she'd always been enough. Later, as we cleaned up together, I found myself thinking about that Thanksgiving call that had started everything. The call that had broken my heart, but also somehow saved me. Because without that moment of undeniable cruelty, I might never have stopped accepting crumbs and calling it love. I might never have opened that second envelope. I might never have learned that Grandpa had seen me, truly seen me, and loved me enough to force me to save myself first. As I watched Ashley confidently manage her business, Mum embrace her friend who'd been saved, and Dad finally find his voices into supporting us, I understood what Grandpa knew all along. Justice isn't about revenge. Justice is when the wounded find healing and use their scars to light the way for others. The $25 million Ashley would eventually access wasn't meant to make her rich. It was meant to make her whole, and my $3 million wasn't a reward for being strong. It was permission to stop proving my strength through sacrifice. We'd both gotten exactly what we needed, even if it looked nothing like what we'd expected. Grandpa had known this all along, and finally, so did I. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to this entire journey. Sometimes the hardest truths we face aren't about the people who hurt us, but about the patterns we've been living in without even realizing it. Breaking generational cycles takes courage, and learning that you deserve love without sacrifice takes a lifetime of unlearning. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been the person everyone relied on, but no one thought to support? Have you watched someone you love get caught in a destructive relationship? Or maybe you've been actually realizing too late that someone saw you as a transaction rather than a person. Your stories matter, and this community is stronger when we share them. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who's been making themselves smaller so others can feel bigger. Someone who needs permission to finally put themselves first. Leave it a like and comment below. I read every single one, and your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Until next time, remember that you are enough exactly as you are without carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations.